Everyone, and welcome to the 25th meeting in 2013 of the Finance Committee of the Scottish Parliament. Can I please just remind everyone present to please turn off any mobile phones, tablets or electronic devices. The first item on our agenda today is to decide whether to take items 3 and 4 in private. Are members agreed? Members have indicated their agreement. Our second item of business today is to continue our oral evidence sessions as part of this committee's scrutiny of the draft budget 2014-15. Can I therefore welcome to the meeting our first group of witnesses today, who are Rakir Shah of SCVO, Stephen Boyd of the STC, Kay Sillars of Unison, Martin Evans of Carnegie Trust, Angela Hagan, Scottish Women's Budget Group, and Francis Stewart of Oxfam Scotland. So welcome to you all this morning. If you wish to speak, please just indicate to myself or the clerk. The session is intended to be a fluid discussion, so please feel free to contribute at any point. You can come in as often as you so wish, and if someone says anything you wish to come in behind that, please let me know. I intend to structure the discussion as far as is possible around the questions in the committee's call for evidence. So we will begin by asking views on the progress being made by the government in meeting its outcomes and targets as set out in the National Performance Framework. But of course we will move on to cover all aspects of the framework, and people can make any contributions they so wish. Stephen, I wonder if we can start off with your own observations and views.
Thank you, Convener. The STUC very much welcomes the Scottish Government's approach to the National Performance Framework, and we've recently started engaging at a high ministerial level on the current nature of the framework and ways in which we think it might be improved. As we outline in our presentation, we think there are, however, a number of quite serious issues with the framework. We think if you look at the overarching purpose of sustainable economic growth, I think as we go through in the submission, there's a number of issues about using GDP as the relevant indicator there, and we think there are others that are more appropriate. We think there's issues around about the relevance of that target. I mean, what, given current economic circumstances, the Scottish Government can reasonably be expected to do in that regard, both in the short term and indeed in the longer term, when we're faced with the UK Government their approach to economic policy at this moment in time. Then it's unreasonable, I think, to expect that the Scottish Government can use the limited levers it has to increase the growth rate in the shorter term. We think there's some quite serious issues around about the consistency of the various targets, and would draw attention to Scotland being the best location in Europe in which to do business, and the supplementary target on more and better jobs. We think there is a tension there. There are perhaps ways in which these can be reconciled, but I think it's important that we do recognise there's a tension. We think also there's a number of additional measures that should be included. I'll go back again to the, how we measure national collective prosperity. GDP is not an appropriate measure for this. We've been discussing with the First Minister and others ways in which we might perhaps look at real median wages, the increase in real median wages as a better guide to collective prosperity, or even better real household disposable income, which includes benefits and transfers. Clearly from the STUC, coming from a work-focused perspective, we are concerned that the framework as it currently stands doesn't include sufficient reference to the workplace, to the nature of work, to how people experience and are treated at work. And if you look at the good work been undertaken recently by Oxfam and Carnegie, both of their, the research undertaken by both does emphasise that to most people, how they experience the workplace has a major impact on their well-being. And again, we think there's work been undertaken elsewhere by the ILO at a global level and by some individual countries that could be built upon to make sure that the National Performance Framework does begin to reflect the workplace better at a Scottish level. So, I mean, to summarise, we think there's much to be applauded in the National Performance Framework. We do think it's generally speaking the right approach, but we think there's quite a lot that can be done to improve upon it as it currently stands.
Thank you. I mean, I notice in terms of you talking about contradictions, you say that, for example, there's contradiction between increasing the number of business start-ups and improving productivity. Why do you feel that's a contradiction?
Well, because unfortunately the vast majority of business startups tend to be low productivity businesses. They tend to be marginal, underperforming, small size companies. And if you do, well, I mean, if you accept, and there's a debate to be had around about this, but if you accept that productivity is the most important metric, then you wouldn't necessarily set about that by trying to increase the business birth rate. I mean, you're likely to see in the short, medium, and I would argue in the longer term, a detriment to productivity in that regard.
Additional businesses in the economy increase the overall productivity of the economy, the overall output of the economy?
I would argue that research suggests otherwise. If you look at the really good research in Scotland that's been done on policies to increase the business birth rate and the aggregate impact on the economy, you've seen that not only did they not have a positive impact on productivity, they actually have a detrimental impact on employment. They tend to destroy jobs rather than create them, because what you have are businesses setting up in markets where they are, as I say, marginal, undersized. Their productivity is much below the market leaders in these specific sectors, and therefore they don't create the jobs, and the fact that they very often fold after a short period of time then has a knock-on negative impact on other small businesses in the sector. So I think we have to, there's a kind of orthodox belief out there that I think is very much at odds with the evidence in this point.
Okay, John.
Thanks, Convener. You made the point that there would be things in Scotland Performs National Performance Framework that the government is not responsible for. And it was just on that question, I mean, should it be then purely things that the government is responsible for, or should it be just how the whole nation is performing? Because I think Unifson quoted from earlier on when it was launched, when it said, for many of the progress measures, responsibility for success is shared between the Scottish Government, partners and local government, universities, business community and individual Scots. I mean, do we need two separate things there, or should we be doing one or the other?
I don't think we do require two separate things, and I think it's absolutely appropriate to have targets in there that the government doesn't exert total control over, because I mean, as you've just alluded to, then it would be quite a scant framework. There wouldn't be very much in it, but I just think it has to be developed on the understanding that government's impact is often quite marginal in some of these issues. I mean, I take it again, the overarching purpose of sustainable economic growth. I mean, I think there's often a view abroad that that is simply a function of government policy in the short, medium and longer terms. Again, I would argue the evidence suggests that government's impact, particularly in the longer term, again, is quite marginal. So I've got no problem with it being in there. I just think we all have to understand the extent to which government can influence that factor at the end of the day.
Okay, Michael, to be followed by Malcolm.
Just a point on the issue that John introduced there about where does responsibility lie. You can measure inputs, but in terms of outcomes, where do we get the data? How do you judge whether the input has been successful or not? And SCVO sort of touched on this in their contribution. It said, within such a framework, Scottish Government should be accountable for its performance in contributing to these outcomes, but not accountable for the outcomes themselves. I mean, that seems to me to be pretty woolly. If you've got to judge the impact of what the government's input is, then surely if the input doesn't achieve the outcomes and the targets that are set within the framework, then it's got to be held accountable for that. And you can't just say, oh, well, they were right to put that amount of money in. The fact that it didn't work or it didn't achieve the outcome, that's all our fault. That's not really the government's.
Sorry, you want me or
anyone? We're discussing the issue.
It's not just all questions to Stephen Boyd. No, it's Michael's just making a point. Sorry, sorry, Malcolm, to be followed by Angela.
Yeah, well, and I was going to ask Stephen, it was getting into that framework. Well, I'm glad Angela's following, because obviously I'd like to hear more from her in terms of how we build the equality statement into the budget, but I'm sure she's going to tell us that. So I really just want to raise 2 points with Stephen. It was kind of issues that came up last week, so I just wondered what you thought about whether it would be any improvement or just a marginal improvement to use GNP rather than GDP, although I understand it's quite difficult to get measures of that, but at least that would exclude profits that go out of the country, as it were. But the other point was a suggestion from his namesake, and perhaps you don't often agree with your namesake from the Royal Bank of Scotland, but he suggested, sorry?
Boyle.
He's Boyle, well there you are.
That's caused some confusion.
Right, I'll rephrase that. The person that has a similar name to you from the Royal Bank of Scotland suggested there should be an indicator for median household disposable income, which I thought was rather a good idea, and I wondered whether you thought that would be something, because obviously part of the problem with focusing on growth is that you can have a growing economy with increasing inequality, which is not what we want.
Yep, I mean, in the first point, I think a GNP measure for Scotland would be tremendously helpful in terms of the economic debate we're currently having at this moment in time. In terms of the national performance framework, if what we're looking at is the change over time, then I'm not entirely sure that it would make a huge difference to include GNP rather than the GDP. But I'd certainly be open to that discussion. I think the fact that we don't have a GNP indicator is certainly detrimental to the quality of economic debate at this moment in time. In terms of your second point, and not for the first time actually, I do agree with my near namesake at the Royal Bank of Scotland. I think that would be a much better indicator of national collective prosperity than the GDP, which we're focused on at the moment.
Angela?
Thank you, Convener. I wanted to link my comment to the question around, or comment from Michael around state influence. And I think one of the things that's quite striking reading across the budget documents and more widely is the range of measurement frameworks and standards to which public authorities are required to respond, and the extent to which those frameworks align with the National Performance Framework and the extent of misalignment potentially. And the other area of misalignment I think that there is the compliance with the public sector equality duties and the extent to which the duties are complied with by public authorities, and recent evidence from the Equality and Human Rights Commission has shown us the extent to which public authorities have responded and how they have responded to the first round of that, and it's not terribly positive reading. And I think there's a role there for the government, Scottish Government, to make greater use of the levers it has available and to demonstrate greater leadership around compliance on public sector equality duty, and within that leadership on equality impact assessment. The Equality Budget Statement is a very positive addition to our framework of our key policy pillars, if you like. But it's not an equality impact assessment of the budget, not yet, by a long shot, despite significant improvements. And we've consistently argued, as have others, I see from the Royal Society of Edinburgh submission, for example, talking about the importance of integrating the equality budget and the equality analysis of the budget within the National Performance Framework, so that these different pillars or different strands of the process are much more effectively interlinked, and that the Equality Budget Statement demonstrate how progress is being made towards the national outcomes, which in themselves, I think, again, coming back round to the earlier part of the discussion in terms of progress on meeting the outcomes and targets, some of the outcomes we would perhaps, or rather some of the targets and outcomes, I think, could be better or lack nuance, and they lack depth and texture that doesn't come through, even if you drill down, as the Equality and Human Rights Commission have highlighted, there's a problem with data, but also a problem with the interplay between outcomes. So in pursuing participation rates and skills improvement, are we necessarily tackling inequalities when 25,000 modern apprenticeships may continue to perpetuate the occupational segregation and limited access that we know about? So in terms of improvement within how we measure and how we set the outcomes, greater recognition of the interplay between outcomes would be helpful.
Francis?
Just to come back on your initial point about progress, I guess the committee will have seen the scorecards that the Scottish Government have produced based on the 50 national indicators. So from a sort of brief cursory glance at that, you could see that the Government is making more progress against certain indicators than it's not. I'd want to caveat that with a number of issues. One is the point that Stephen made about to what extent is the Scottish Government responsible for that progress. Another is an issue around data and indicators in themselves. And to give one example of that is looking at the solidarity target, which I think at the moment has performance maintaining, but that's to increase the proportion of income going to the bottom 3 income groups. That before recently, that was on a downward trend until the post-financial crisis when it improved. And that wasn't because suddenly the bottom 3 income groups, their income improved. It was because the middle class fell. They lost income. So suddenly that gave it a sort of, if you looked at it, suddenly performance is maintaining, but that wasn't because the poorest people in our society were better off. So there's an issue around looking at indicators in themselves. We need to look at a sort of richer array of indicators to get a proper picture of what's actually happening. The other issue for Oxfam is about the targets and indicators themselves, and I agree with a lot of what Stephen said about the overall purpose targets. A lot of those are focused around economic growth, and we have issues with that, which we can perhaps come back to.
Well, I mean, while you're there, I mean, I know in your paper you say you're talking about decent, safe, secure and affordable housing and prioritising investment in this area, but I mean, and you go on to talk about living in a clean and healthy local environment where people can enjoy going outside, etc. But I mean, if you've not got a growing economy, how can you actually afford to produce, you know, secure and affordable housing? I'm kind of I'm interested in how you can achieve a better society without any. If there's no growth, then to raise people from the bottom, then people from the top have to be reduced. I take it that's what you're saying basically. And what about how would that impact on Scotland in a global competitive economy? You know, we're not a closed society. You know, so the incentive for people to stay and work in Scotland at the top end would be surely diminished.
Yeah, from Oxfam's point of view, we're not saying we're against economic growth. We just want a wider debate about the type of economic growth and the quality of economic growth. We've been working in Scotland. We've had a domestic poverty programme since 1996. But if we look even further back than that, for 30 years, we've seen up until the financial crisis, the GDP of Scotland was growing at about 2% per year. But throughout that period, we still saw a persistent amount of people in Scotland in poverty, between a quarter and a third, looking at different measures. So from our point of view, economic growth was failing to really trickle down to those people and benefit them. For that reason, I think that's why we'd like to see a wider range of purpose targets, a wider range of indicators, looking at the quality and distribution of economic growth. We use a phrase saying that economic growth is consumption-orientated and distribution-blind. So in terms of some of the proposals that we'd like to see perhaps put into National Performance Framework, Stephen's been asked the question, we'd fully endorse putting an indicator around medium income, household income, or median wages in there. That would be a better measure of looking at the benefit of economic growth to the typical household in Scotland. We'd also propose looking at things like the Gini coefficient in terms of looking at inequality within our economy, as well as you could put that alongside the solidarity target. We'd also like to see indicators around work quality. So not just looking at employment rates, but also looking at the type of jobs those are, the security and suitability and quality of those jobs. And we'd like to see one of the other purpose targets is around economic participation rates, and as well as looking at that between the poorest and the richest in Scotland, we'd like to see that widen to look at healthy life expectancy for the poorest and the richest. The cohesion target I'm talking about here, that would benefit from also looking at the health inequalities in Scotland rather than just the economic participation rates.
Thanks for that, Francis. There's no one who's actually indicated that they want to contribute at this point. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Just a question on the back of Francis' comments there. Well, we've heard repeatedly in this committee about the need for good data to assess how things are moving forward, but then we can't get agreement about what data is we need to look at. And you've just given us an example there of using the Gini coefficient to set aside some of the other data. But one of the faults, I mean, the Gini coefficient is a good indicator of equality in terms of income, but it doesn't take account of property wealth. So we then have to start looking at how we find an indicator that indicates, you know, where people's wealth lies in terms of property, and then develop policies around how you assess the property aspect of it. So, you know, looking at the data, we need to get an agreement about what exactly the data is that we need to judge whether the targets are being met or not. Francis?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to this in terms of what we're using the National Performance Framework for. One is as a measurement tool to look at Scotland's progress against a range of indicators. But the other, and perhaps more important aspect, is as a policy driver, or as a way to prioritise and allocate resources. And from Oxfam's point of view, the reason that we did our work around the Humankind Index was the second aspect for us is much more important. We want to see what the priorities are for the people of Scotland, and then we want to push policies to deliver on those. So from our point of view, I think there's a big job to be done with the National Performance Framework in terms of going out, engaging with communities, particularly the most disadvantaged communities, and really getting from them an aspect of what are the things that matter to them, and only then can you then build in what indicators do you need to look at. And so for us, the most important point is to look at the priorities and to deliver on those.
We didn't have anyone who was wanting to contribute, and I was going to move to here, but we've since had a flurry of people who indicated. So the first one will be Gavin, to be followed by Kay.
Just reflecting on last week's discussion, there were two themes that came out, and I'd just be interested to hear any witnesses' views on them. One was the number of indicators that we currently have. Do we have too many? Do we not have enough? Do we have the right number? And secondly, on the face of it, all indicators at the moment are broadly treated equally. Do witnesses have views? Should we prioritise some indicators over another? Should there be, I mean, there was a suggestion from one witness last week that there ought to be some kind of informal grading system to look at how important individual indicators were in the broad scheme of things. I would just welcome any witnesses' views on those two.
So we're actually going to move on to that anyway, so that's quite helpful, Gavin. Okay, Kay, to be followed by Martin.
Sorry, I was just going to say that the Gini coefficient is just a sum, and you can measure anything you want with it, and there are wealth measures for Gini, and we would lean towards using wealth rather than income because of the giant inequalities in wealth and how that needs to be tackled. And it's, I think, don't want to spend all day talking about how you do the sums, but I think it's about the interaction of indicators, and if we're to make this work better, it's about not just what you measure, because what you measure is always just a proxy for really what's going on, but how you look at how they interact with each other, and any indicator on their own will only tell you what you've measured. And I think there's a wider issue in Scotland about how much data we collect, but how inaccessible it actually is to people to use. And I'd like to see wider access to the data to allow people to measure what they want, rather than people telling us what we should be looking at. So people will be looking at data on different levels, and we should maybe access that better.
Martin, to be followed by Jean.
I just wanted to make the point about how positive we were about the National Performance Framework in an international context. When we started our work in 2011, after the Stiglitz report, we weren't expecting to find Scotland was an international leader in this. In fact, we were very surprised about that. So we did our report in 2011, and then I asked my staff to go and visit North America and Europe to look at the other countries trying this. And again, we came back to the conclusion the National Performance Framework is a tool of international significance. And it's not just us saying that. Professor Stiglitz said that at the OECD meeting in New Delhi last year. We are in danger of forgetting the wood for the misunderstanding the wood for the trees here. The reason why it's important is twofold. One, it actually does go beyond GDP. Our 2011 report said this was actually one of the major constraints in public policy debate post the 2008 fiscal crisis. We said over-reliance on GDP as a measure makes it difficult for politicians to back policies that are not good for society or the environment if they hamper an increase. And the National Performance Framework actually does do that. It's GDP plus. It says GDP is important. I think you've indicated that you probably think that too. But also there's a range of other things that are important. And this dashboard allows performance to be assessed. Now, we'll come on to the details of how well it's assessed. I think it does very well as a performance tool. It's far less successful as an accountability tool. That's the second point. So if I say, what are the two main reasons why we think it's effective? It's beyond GDP, but more importantly, again, it's focused on outcomes. And that's a debate we've had very confidently in Scotland, and I think we're comfortable with that, and it's not elsewhere. We're concentrating elsewhere in the UK on inputs. Outcomes is quite a leap forward. Rather than talking about the number of nurses or the number of police officers, we're talking about what impact good health has on people, how people's fear of crime is dealt with. I think that's a great benefit of the National Performance Framework. I wanted to say that, Convener, because I do agree there's lots to be improved in this, and we shouldn't in any way be complacent. But we tend in my experience working in the UK and wider, not to see excellence on our own doorstep. And I wouldn't be afraid of saying it was rubbish if I thought it was rubbish. But absolutely, we should be really proud that it is of international significance and build it beyond that. There's many improvements that can be made.
Thank you. A number of witnesses said similar things last week, I'm pleased to say. I mean, I'm not a big fan of GDP. I think, however, it is an internationally recognised measure, and I think the issue there for the Scottish Government is if they went away from GDP completely, I think, you know, opponents would basically say we were trying to obscure bad economic performance, however it happened to be. So I think it's an issue that we have to deal with, whether we like it or not, until there's a better recognised measure. But that doesn't mean, as you rightly said, we can't have additional measures that we can actually look at to look at other aspects of performance. Jean, to be followed by John.
I think I really wanted to pick up on Gavin's point, because I do think that the work that Oxfam has done with the Humankind Index is really relevant and really interesting. And I guess my question is that is there an opportunity, or do people feel that there's a real opportunity to review the National Performance Framework to the point where we would weight that, particularly maybe inside of some of the equality issues, or the other thing is there an opportunity to introduce some of the measures that we would like to see in the National Performance Framework, and what would have to go if we were to do that? I mean, I think certainly in last week's roundtable discussion, it was felt that are there already too many, and if there was an opportunity to replace, what would it be? GNP? Would that be the next thing? But particularly the weighting, I think, because I do think that has quite a bearing and probably would show a slightly different and maybe a wee bit more a better picture of the outcomes.
Sorry, John.
Thanks. Really to pick up on one or two points that have been raised already. I mean, Francis Stewart with Oxfam. I mean, I saw in your report in paragraph 11 it said, with the focus solely on economic growth. And I take the point that in a lot of papers from the government and elsewhere it does emphasise, I'm not sure I would go as far as saying it was solely on economic growth. And in fact, at last year's budget, we were criticised, or at least some people criticised the government for protecting the health budget at the expense of business growth and other things. And in fact, on top of that, increasing business rates by more than inflation. So despite, is there an issue there, I just wonder, between what the National Performance Framework says and what is actually happening? And what is actually happening is more in line with what you might be arguing for than appears to be the case. And the other point, just following on from what Martin Evans just said, I mean, you've been quite positive this morning, saying that it is basically good, could be improved, it's not rubbish. By contrast, Unison, I think, said it is rubbish. So I just wonder, you know, does Unison just feel this is so awful that we might as well throw it out, or does Unison feel that there's room for improvement? And finally, he said, I mean, it's good that we're not just talking about the number of nurses. Well, in this committee, we're not just talking about the number of nurses, but as soon as we get into the chamber, that is exactly what we talk about, and everybody forgets about the National Performance Framework. How do we sort that?
Hold on a second. First of all, I'm going to let Francis come in, and then Kay should really be able to come in after that. Okay.
Just looking at our submission in paragraph 11, I think when we were saying the focus solely on economic growth, we were referring to other policies out with the National Performance Framework. So I think you really got to the heart of the matter there in terms of saying it's not the National Performance Framework which is focusing solely on economic growth, but in terms of the crucial issue of how the National Performance Framework then relates to policies and resource allocation that then comes forward. Too often we see from government policies the purpose and the focus on sustainable economic growth is really there, and a lot of the other aspects aren't there to the same extent. So I think you're right in pointing that out.
Sorry if it seems really harsh. I think the point that we're making isn't so much about the principle, which I think we really support, and I'd agree with everything Stephen said in his opening. and just that wider way of measuring how things go on. But what I focused on was how it's physically working and how it operates. And in itself, the website and how it's been used is really quite disappointing. It's difficult to use, even for someone whose job it is to use. You know, you start off in 2007 figures, and it's just, I suppose, disappointing that it isn't much more core to the work. It doesn't seem to have had appropriate investment and just doesn't be user-friendly. And I think the worry for us is if that doesn't get resolved, then we won't move the debate on, and we need to move the debate on to all the real issues that we're talking about, so that it's not just there's 1,000 extra police officers, well, that's great. It's what's actually happening on our streets. What is the investment in schools? You know, that's what we want to look at. So I suppose, sorry about the tone, but it is about saying we would really like this to work, and it doesn't, as it stands, work as a kind of basic website. So I suppose it's about the practicalities, not the principles.
Okay, I want to move on to the linkage between the performance information and spending priorities, and whether witnesses and indeed members of committee feel that there is evidence for the impact of the National Performance Framework on spending decisions. Martin.
We did look at this, and we looked at it around a number of countries, and there is in fact very little evidence about the impact. And that's not to say there isn't an impact, it's just that there's no effective research been undertaken in a complex subject. So I would make the point that further investment in research to try to establish that link in a complex policy environment between what are the drivers, what are the outcomes you're seeking, and what are the drivers that actually make those outcomes happen. So the point would be, again, if we were confident about the National Performance Framework, more confident in my view, we would encourage more research and fund more research into this linkage. I think it is there, it is to be found, but I would be quite frank with you, we haven't found any good standard research to make the links that you're asking for.
Okay. Angela, to be followed by Rukia.
Thank you. Again, just to reiterate maybe some of my earlier points about the interrelationship between the government economic strategy, stating the overarching purpose of government, the budget and the equality budget statement, and the interplay between those kind of pillars of government policy, and how the National Performance Framework and the whole mechanism around Scotland Performs can inform that, and how they mutually inform one another. And I think there is room for improvement in terms of how the budget explains, sets out how resources are being, how it's directing resources to deliver clear outcomes that are then informed through the National Performance Framework, which in turn should be informed by the plethora of other measurement and target frameworks to which public authorities funded through public finances are held to account. That includes, say, the heat targets or the public sector equality duties and so on, for there to be far greater integration of these mechanisms. And I think in that way, the contribution of public spending towards clear outcomes would be made much clearer. That said, I think the outcomes in themselves could be, if not clearer, but perhaps different. And I think a core question that the Scottish Women's Budget Group and others have consistently raised is, within the purpose of government and the defining objectives of government, the extent to which equality as a driver of public policy is questionable, and resource allocation on that basis, I think, again, is questionable. So seeing this greater relationship between the economic strategy, how the budget delivers on that, and how the equality budget statement is one way of reporting or providing information on how resource allocation is meeting those objectives. And Martin raised, I think, a very important point on the distinction between performance and accountability, and where accountability lies. And that, again, is an area that could be strengthened within the National Performance Framework, and this relationship between the multiplicity of other targets at regulatory and policy that public authorities are required to meet.
Okay, I mean, I guess just to start, I just want to say that, you know, from our perspective, the whole principle behind a national performance framework is a great idea. And, you know, it builds on the Virginia model, which was very well received in North America, in the area in which it was taken forward. But the problem we have with this, and this goes directly to your question, Mr. Gibson, it comes across as a communication tool rather than a strategic tool. And even as a communication tool, it doesn't come across very well, because not many people outside, you know, the circle that might take an interest in these things actually know much about the National Performance Framework. So it's not even very effective in that regard. And as a strategic tool, the only objective that is really drummed that we ever pick up from our discussion with various officials at different levels in different areas is the one around economic growth, and not even sustainable economic growth. And this, we have picked up, leads to a lot of conflicting priorities. So there's various other pressures, not necessarily coming from directly from the National Performance Framework, but other pressures and other priorities that then are conflicting with the economic growth one. And economic growth is now seen as to be the main principle at the heart, the main driver of various regulation and various functions of the public sector, whether it's public service delivery, whether it's procurement of public services, whether it's providing care, health, regeneration. And I think part of our problem here is having such a focus on economic growth, echoing some of the points before, means that some of the rest of the good ideas that have come through in the National Performance Framework can get a bit lost. Now, our message is quite a simple one. We've got a situation here where the government sets the outcomes, sets the measures, and then tells us how well they are doing to meet them. Now, there's something not quite right about that. I think we need to try and adjust that slightly. We need to kind of take a slightly different approach. I don't think the approach that's being taken is very effective. And the approach that we would suggest, which we put in our submission, is that the national outcomes and the measures should be a co-produced effort, should be something that's set with wider society, with the business community, with civil society, with academia. Then everybody will buy into them. And then off the back of that, through Scotland Performs, the government can show how they are progressing to meet those shared national outcomes. Then it would genuinely be a set of national outcomes. I think that would then give us a performance framework that's simultaneously strategic, but also is communicated, because a lot of people have got investment in them, have got a stake in them. So that is the message that we would like to put forward to the Committee on the National Performance Framework.
Martin.
Just to develop that point, I think it was one of the weaknesses when the National Performance Framework was established in 2007. It was established very quickly, of course, because of how the government had to be formed. It didn't engage civil society about the domains of well-being or the measures or the outcomes that were being sought. It's one of the reasons we're funding the Humankind Index with Oxfam, is to have a wider civic engagement with this idea of well-being and how you measure it. Our recommendation in 2011 to the Scottish Government was they do go through a process of engagement with civil society and wider about the outcomes and the domains. And John Swinney runs an informal round table in this building where a number of us attend about the National Performance Framework. And we're talking about how we can find mechanisms to do exactly what is being suggested, is to make this more owned. Because I don't think there are a wider range of domains of well-being that can be identified. I might be wrong about that, but I think people should be asked about that. They were never asked in the first place. The difficulty would be sometimes people then go on and ask about the technical aspects of how you measure, and I don't think many of us are competent to actually give the answer to that, because it's quite complicated. No doubt we can ask people, but the key here is, going back to what Rakia was saying, is that it was a weakness. It should be rectified by more public engagement. The Oxfam work on humankind is not in any way in tension with the National Performance Framework. It's trying to draw out what people think about well-being. We should ask more about the domains of well-being, and technically we could give you and the committee and others a discussion about how we measure, because there are some things we're not measuring at the moment and some things we think we should measure. But that is not what I would consult the general public on. But that point about engagement comes back to this accountability issue. It's not well known. I agree with that. People don't have a great sense of ownership. Within the Parliament, when we were doing some work 2 years ago, it wasn't very well known. Your committee doing this work, I think, will up that status. I think it will, if it's successful, the work that you're doing and others doing, it will become increasingly an important mechanism of holding governments to account. I'll say one more thing. We did a lot of work last month in Northern Ireland, and the Northern Irish finance ministers coming across to Scotland to look at the performance framework, because in a very divided society, having a discussion about what well-being is stops the discussion about who should benefit from the distribution of public money. It creates an abstract discussion about what we're all trying to achieve in society. And I think that's another great benefit of this, to be exported elsewhere, as to say, leaving aside your factional interests, what would you say you would like from society? What aspects would you like to see improve? And actually, that's what's at the heart of this. Of course, it says GDP must move in a certain direction. I think that's quite reasonable. But other things must move in directions about well-being. And I think that it should allow civil society and wider to have a discussion about what kind of society we want. And the reason why that's important, GDP did move up by 11% between 2003 and 2008. Median incomes, quoting the stat that Stephen was talking about, didn't change at all during that period. So there is something of a disconnect which people know, but they need to engage with. And I think that will make, frankly, the job of political discourse, come back to John Mason's point, slightly easier. It won't resolve the problem you raised about inputs, but it might make it slightly easier to have a conversation about outcomes we desire and what process you get the outcomes you desire. Is it just by putting more and more in to public spend, or is it by doing it more wisely, or doing it slightly differently?
You're keen for the National Performance Framework to be on a statutory basis?
Yeah, we are. Yes, we made that recommendation. Mm-hmm. The reason is this: it's not to make, some people have misunderstood that, to make it as though the outcomes or targets become obligatory or statutory. It's not at all. What we feel, if there's cross-party support, and we feel there is for the National Performance Framework, it is quite clear in other jurisdictions that if you don't get that and embed it, it gets lost in a change of government. And that happened in France, and there was a danger of that happening in Virginia. That's why they embedded their performance framework. With the cross-party support, you have the process being statutory. An incoming government can change the purpose, it can change the targets, it can consult on those, but actually having that both performance tool and the accountability tool in statute, I think, would be a great benefit for the public discourse on this complex matter of how do we change the world, and what do we change it to, and how do we affect that change?
Okay. Let's move on to how the National Performance Framework can better be employed to inform policy development and spending decisions. Anyone got any comment to make on that? Francis?
One of the things that Oxfam have developed recently, and we launched last night actually, and Jean Urquhart and Stephen Boyd were on the panel, and one of Martin's colleagues from Carnegie was on the panel as well, is what we're calling the Oxfam Humankind Index Policy Assessment Tool. And the idea, it does, doesn't it? The idea behind this is to look at any given policy and take policymakers, NGOs, campaigners, activists, the general public through a step-by-step process through each of the different factors of prosperity or priorities contained in the Humankind Index, and to make people think about those factors when they're assessing a policy. So it does come up with an overall score, an assessment, a visual representation of that assessment, but the idea behind that is really to draw out the factors that are contained in the Humankind Index that we believe are a good representation of what people in Scotland, particularly in the most disadvantaged communities, need to live well in their communities, and to really bring out those factors when policymakers are assessing policies.
Martin?
I agree with that, and congratulations to Oxfam for the work that they're doing on this. That's the one. We have three things we think you could try to embed this issue in policy making and funding decisions. One is by using such a tool as Oxfam are developing, which we're happy and very pleased to have been supported. The other one is introducing a well-being impact assessment for policies. It's a more formal structure whereby you might ask the civil servants then to actually take the National Performance Framework and look at that range of issues which are interconnected in a complex way and say, what would then happen if we did X or Y? So that will be the second measure after the Oxfam index. And the other one is to introduce some sort of green book approach. And that advises civil servants on appraising proposals before committing funding to it. So these are technical measures we think could go inside the machinery of government, the last two, and the one that Francis was talking about is outside the machinery of government, to up the idea of accountability and scrutiny of what the objectives and performance and progress is.
Stephen.
I've got a very compelling answer to your question, but I think it's important to note the distance that we have to travel on this. When we come back to Martin's comments about the groundbreaking nature of the NPF, I think they're very well made, and I think we would agree with a lot of what he has to say. I think we'd also accept that it does certainly go beyond GDP in terms of the way it's designed. But going back to comments that Ruchir and Francis made, as we go about our daily business and engaging with the Scottish Government across all its departments, we just do not see the breadth of the measures included in the National Performance Framework reflected in our engagement with government. I mean, I think there's a major job on the hands of ministers to embed the National Performance Framework in government before we go any further. I mean, as I go about my main interest in economic development, and it's absolutely predicated on sustainable economic growth. I mean, even the purpose targets around solidarity and cohesion are very much lost from that discussion. I mean, it's really difficult, and I think a debate I was involved in recently in one of our more peripheral economies, which is struggling badly at this moment in time, and the debate was very much around about how to increase sustainable economic growth on the back of the government's sector-led industrial strategy. And we're raising some issues about the relevance of that sector-led strategy in an area of the country that's really not active in any of these sectors at all. Then we need to go back to redesigning that policy, and if we're going to do that, then we need government to understand that it really has to use these solidarity and cohesion targets to drive action in a way that's just not happened since they were included in the original economic strategy back in September 2007. I mean, they really haven't driven policy at all. So, I mean, it's a wee bit of a pessimistic intervention, I guess, and I'm not answering your question, but I just don't think, even within government, we have made much progress since the framework was designed and embedding it in how policy is made. And some of the actions that Martin's mentioned, like a wellbeing impact assessment, I mean, I have to be quite cynical about it. I don't think it's a bad idea at all, but I look at how equality impact assessments are used, I look at how business impact assessments are used, and they're very often just tools of okaying the policy on the basis of the most facile, kind of, less than rigorous assessment of the impact of the policy. I mean, I don't think these are tools within government that actually change the nature of policy development.
Thanks for that honest appraisal. Ruchir, to be followed by Kay.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, one of the axes here that I think we really need to take into account is the axis of how do we get some of the most vulnerable people in our communities to be involved and to have a meaningful engagement with these kind of policy tools. If you look at the National Performance Framework as a policy tool, how does it reflect the priorities of the people of Scotland, including those that do not vote? I think that's quite critical. Everyone in society needs to have a real stake in those outcomes. Now, I think we've mentioned the Humankind Index as one policy tool, very effective policy tool, I think, that's been developed, is still being developed, which can bring in some of the voices that might not normally be part of these kind of discussions in a way in which is meaningful to them. We do need to kind of invest and look at more ways in which we can develop policy tools like the Humankind Index in order to bring that perspective from those that who do not vote, who do not have a kind of stake in the discussions that are taking place within this inner circle of those in the know with the policy frameworks that we're looking at the moment. I'm not entirely sure how to do that, but I think the solution has to be a wider discussion, a wider engagement across society.
Okay, Kate, to be followed by Angela.
Stephen actually ended up coming to the point that I was going to make, which is that we talk a lot about getting new tools and new impact assessments, but unless we embed the ones we've currently got into the structure, then the way policy is being developed isn't changing in the slightest. So as the organisation's really pushing for equality impact assessments and all those things to go on, when you look at the assessments at the end of papers, they're tag-ons, you think, sometimes I think, my child could have written that better, and it's quite disappointing. So Unison's been very supportive of Oxfam's work, and we would never complain about that. But the issue is not the tools, but how we embed those tools in the process, and whether people are held accountable for those not being used or not being used properly. And so, post-16 bill, I think it almost said at the end, women go to college and that'll be great. And you think, what? I mean, it's just really quite disappointing. So I think we can spend a lot of time as kind of policy geeks talking about tools and how good they would be and how that would be, but we need to look at how the tools are being used and hold people accountable for that.
If that was really exactly what it said, but
no, I'm sorry.
I get the drift.
But
clearly you're in favour of consolidation rather than additional indicators. I mean, Stephen's near namesake last week talked about if one indicator is added, one should be removed in order to make it, you know, so we don't end up with just this ever-increasing number of indicators. Angela, to be followed by John.
Thank you. I think a number of the points I would make about embedding equality impact assessment have been made in this year's equality budget statement, while again showing lots of positive improvements. And I think, you know, to echo Martin's points about recognising excellence on our own doorstep, this is an innovation of the Scottish Government, and we're very, you know, we would very much welcome it. But what the equality budget statement also says is this is an outline assessment, an outline indication, and the equality impact assessments will follow, stating very clearly that equality impact assessment is still treated as a post hoc exercise in the policy appraisal process, which is not its intention and is not going to deliver the kind of policy change or the link between policy and resources that this kind of analysis requires. And I think what we see from successful either equality budgeting or other outcome and performance related budgeting exercises across the world is where there is a very clear conceptual framework. What are the government's priorities? And how are the budgets, how are resources being used to deliver on them? And that the policy process, policy options require to answer how proposals will advance specific objectives. And that's the starting point for other, you know, in other jurisdictions. And I think that then leads to far greater linkage between identifying the contribution of resources indirectly and directly to advancing specific policy options. A clear example is the Autonomous Community Government of Andalusia and their Project G+, where gender equality is a motor of change, economic and social change, and all policy proposals are required to be ranked according to the extent to which they drive gender equality, which drives economic and social change. And I think, you know, the Children in Scotland in their submission also pointed to or highlighted this continuing disconnect between being able to identify how resource allocation is contributing to policy shift. And I think one of the ways in which that can be improved is greater evaluation of outcomes from spend, outcomes from policy and programme interventions, and so that the loop is much more complete than it is currently, which would improve performance, measurement, but also and accountability, but also link back into policy appraisal and policy development, which I think is a weak part of our policy cycle overall.
I mean, it's really to press. I mean, the last three folk have spoken, Stephen and Kay and Angela. I mean, I'm just not getting a grip of what we should actually do or what we should change to make this all happen. Because I think what you're saying makes sense, but there is a disconnect at the moment. I mean, should it be that when the Cabinet Secretary brings his budget, part of his speech is to go through all 50 of the indicators? I mean, in practice, I just don't know how that would happen. Or should it be this committee goes through all 50 of the indicators? I mean, I'm also in the Equal Opportunities Committee, and we share your frustration because, again, we've asked all the committees to comment on the kind of equal opportunities side of the budget, and we get just a paragraph at the end. And the committee was genuinely upset, cross-party, last time that we weren't getting that. And I'm just wondering how we do this in practice.
Okay, I'm going to let Angela and then Rocky.
Just very quickly, one way would be the budget strategy phase that the committees engage in over the summer and prior to the budget being brought to Parliament is a key opportunity to expand that part of the budget phase so that to allow for reporting of the kind of reporting that the Scottish Government provided to this committee in advance or alongside the publication of the budget in September, to have that kind of presentation of information to allow far greater scrutiny by the Finance Committee and the subject committees earlier in the process, but also to see the process as ongoing rather than having two specific points in the year, the presentation of the budget and the parliamentary decision of the budget, to regard budget scrutiny, performance and accountability as part of the ongoing business of Parliament and government. And the other issue that is of interest to this committee and has been raised by others in evidence, in written evidence, is the notion of a separate fiscal commission, and to have that another separate body performing or acting in that accountability role. So there are options around whether it's about taking pressure off committees, or the first option, making greater use of the budget scrutiny, budget strategy phase to allow for greater reporting on Scotland Performs.
Here to be followed by Francis.
Yeah, I mean, I would build on what Angela is saying. I had very similar points. I mean, basically, we have in the past suggested a number of times that what we need is some kind of phase well before the budgets are set, or the bills brought forward for the budget, which involves much more information about what the options are. So the finance secretary can say, look, these are some of the resources I've got through Barnett consequentials. These are some of the resources that I've got through business rates or whatever. And these are some of the pressures now on this budget. These are some of the options I'm facing to weigh up. What do you guys think? I'm going to make the decision at the end of the day, but what do you guys think? Let's have an open and fuller debate around that. Now, the Finance Committee in the Parliament can anchor that debate, but it obviously needs to be a much wider debate that goes out towards wider society. The business community needs to take a view, civil society needs to take a view, a much wider range of. And I think what that would do is it would open up the budget process a bit more. At the moment, we have a lot of last-minute fixes, a lot of kind of bartering, a bit less in this particular parliamentary term than the previous one, obviously, but we still have that, and it does make for a situation where we're kind of looking at the aftermath of the budget that we're seeing. We don't know why we came to the decisions, and then we try and construct the kind of route map which the government has gone through in order to come to the decisions that they have made in the particular budget settlement they've come to. Particularly when we're looking at budgets that stretch over a number of years, or even budgets that stretch across major policy developments, such as the referendum. I think it's quite important to have that kind of open discussion and to have the space for that. And that does require more transparency of the budget, more information, not just the kind of big block information that we currently get at the last minute, and that we can then kind of scrutinize almost in a kind of post-scrutiny type phase. And I think having that kind of input from wider society, civil society, business and so on, anchored by the Finance Committee, would make for a much better budgeting process, which everybody can then buy into.
I mean, in a way that does happen, because a lot of the discussions that we have feed into next year's discussion. I mean, it's kind of difficult to do it, just before this year's announced. But I mean, the Cabinet Secretary does get quite a strong steer as to how he should amend budgets as we go forward. And when he does introduce his speech in the time allowed, he does try and explain why he makes one decision as opposed to another in terms of the resources available. But I do take that on board. Francis will be followed by Martin.
Just three quick points, hopefully. One is around the use of tools, and I talked about the policy tool earlier, and I don't really disagree with anything that anyone said about that in terms of the need to try and mainstream other tools into government processes. The reason that we developed that tool wasn't just to have an additional tool for policymakers to use. We developed that as it's a website app, if you like. When we did our press release the other day, we called it an app. So it's open for public and other people to use. So hopefully, ideally, the use of that would be not just for policymakers, but a wider, transparent, accountable tool that people outside government can use. And that by itself will help engage people in these issues. The other aspect is around consultation, which Ruchir talked about. And just to give a bit of background on the Humankind Index, in developing that index and 18 priorities within that, we reached out to about 3,000 people in Scotland, and we did that through a range of methods, through focus groups, community workshops, street stalls, and that wasn't actually a particularly difficult or expensive process. and we did manage to reach out to what we call seldom heard groups, but are often termed hard to reach, and they're not actually that hard to reach. You just have to make an effort to go out and be in their area and listen to what they have to say and fund that process. The third area was around structure of the MPF and scrutiny, and I agree with the comments that Angela and Ruchir just said. For us, around the structure of the MPF is it's quite difficult looking at it in terms of establishing the links between the 50 national indicators, which John Mason said, and the national outcomes and the strategic objectives. I think in terms of reforming that, one way would be to look particularly at the purpose targets and amend those to improve those. Another potential way of doing it would be to look at, within the MPF, the strategic objectives, as far as I can see, aren't really utilised at all, that there's no indicators or outcomes that hang off the strategic objectives. So one way to move towards a sort of better dashboard, if you like, that Joseph Stiglitz has advocated for, would be to really put those strategic objectives at the forefront and then have the national outcomes and the indicators that flow from them.
Thank you. Martin.
In Virginia, they called something the pursuit of why, that one of the most powerful tools on accountability is when you've got some data and you're saying, well, why is that? And in terms of a debate about finance, what investment might prevent that happening or prevent that trend continuing? An example from the data the Scottish Government's given the Environment Committee, visits to people, a percent of people visiting the outdoors has fallen each year for the last 2 years. I have no idea why that might be or what role government might play in that. But this process of open data allows this pursuit of why. It then goes on to the question, which I think is fundamental, which I said right at the beginning, which if you have an outcome, which that is an outcome, people visiting the outdoors, well, what kind of investment would you make? What would be the priority of that investment against other investments? So it allows a more public conversation about something which can become very technical and very dry budgets. And I think that's a great advantage of this. What is it do we value in society? And that's a question that we all would like more conversation about. Well, what is the domains of well-being? How are we going to measure those? What's the performance? And we haven't used that well. I think these kind of charts are increasingly used by the civil servants to inform committees. I think they're a great, or a step forward. And then for committees and us outside and third-party organisations say, well, why? Why is that trend happening in that way? And what would be the impact that we want to see in terms of budget? That would be a conversation that we could engage with rather than a technical one of budgeting. So I think that that would be there. Just to come back on the tools, we in our submission to you set out the 3 mechanisms, and our technical mechanisms, why we think we could, how you can embed MPF more technically. I agree, things like assessments and internal processes I'll always have the danger Andrew was talking about become marginal or post hoc. But that's not to say that they shouldn't be put on the table. And if there are better ones, I would very much welcome them. But at the moment, we have a limited number of tools we could actually put into a very complicated mechanism like the civil service to hope for greater understanding of something like this, which has at its heart something which most governments find very difficult, which is dealing with things not in a silo, across the sectors. They, to give them credit, the Scottish Government's actually changed its structure to try to address that point. But every government finds that very difficult. And finding a mechanism to join the civil servant between health and transport, very, very difficult to imagine what that could be. Our suggestion is some sort of well-being assessment, because you have to know what the impact in one area is, may have in another area. So at least you have a conversation about consequences.
I suppose 2 points. I think really importantly, we have to be able to follow the money better. And there just doesn't seem to be ever a link between we want to get Objective A, and from all these different portfolios, here's the money coming in for Objective A. So, I think, sorry, I can't read without my specs, proportion of schools receiving positive inspection reports, what you're actually doing about that, mainly they're run by local government. So, where does the money go? Is that just the money for teachers? Is that what it is about? And that's probably a bad one I've picked, but those links fall down. But I think we have to be realistic that we're quite an agreed group of people you've called in today, but you probably don't always get get that, and politics and where the money spends is about debating your society. So whoever wins the election does indeed get to set the priorities, and the rest of us get to hold them to account for those priorities. So it's not just whether you delivered the priorities you set yourself out to do, but whether I think those are the right priorities and whether in the long term I'd vote for you again. So there is a debate going on. So it's perfectly acceptable for the government to say, this is what we aim for, this is what we want to do, and here's the money for it. And that's one set of things you need to display. But I think the rest of us also want more access to data so that we can make judgments for ourselves about whether those are our priorities and whether you're achieving them. And that's very, very complex. And people in Scotland's not that homogenous. You'll have a very diverse group of people. And I think today there's been quite a lot of discussion about the value of GDP as a measure. I suspect a whole other set of people you've invited in would have said that was an excellent priority and you should emphasise that above all else. And that's a public debate, which in the end is decided at an election, as it should be.
I don't think anyone's quite said that. But well, thanks very much. Now, we've been in discussion for more than an hour, and obviously we have another panel session. So what I'd like to do is go around the table with each of our 6 witnesses and see if you have any final points that you wish to make. You don't have to if you don't want to, but here's your opportunity to maybe touch on anything that's been missed so far, any point you want to make. Angela.
Thank you, Convener. I was just conscious that perhaps Jean's question about weighting and where equalities came within that hadn't perhaps been addressed. And I think some of the points there are about making specific priorities more visible within the purpose targets and the outcomes associated with them. I think there are issues that arise from lumping, or the approach of tackling inequalities leads to groups and individuals being lumped together, and equality characteristics are not then drawn out, and the different lived experiences of different groups and different individuals on the basis of those characteristics are then either not made available in data and are therefore not made available in the analytical process, and that undermines the approach that Martin's just been positively advocating, this pursuit of why, to better understand why these inequalities, why these experiences arise, to then be better able to target resources for the kinds of outcomes that we want. And I think the other thing in terms of weighting is perhaps rather than because, as John Mason touched on earlier, the political challenges of setting priorities, and I'm not going to get into that, but being clearer perhaps on timeframes and what outcomes and what targets are to be achieved over what time frame would, I think, again, help in performance and accountability measures, and being clear what are the long-term targets, what's the long-term objective, and what outcomes and milestones are being sought along the way, and again would allow for, as Kay's just said, more effective following the money.
Thank you. Okay.
I think there was an interesting point raised earlier, which I think Martin introduced and Angela kind of followed up on, which is around accountability and as opposed to performance, and looking at the distinction between the two. And I just thought it's worth just giving one perspective on that, which hopefully might make some sense. And I think the question that it begs is whose performance is relevant here. And I think with the National Performance Framework, that's got a little bit blurred, because is it government's performance that we're looking at, or is it society's performance? And I think maybe the way out of that is to kind of look at different players being accountable for their own performance to a shared set of outcomes. So if we buy into the idea of the National Performance Framework being essentially about a shared set of national outcomes for society, then government can then report back and be accountable for its performance in meeting those objectives, which needs to be separated out from the more general measures about how well society is doing, because the government is not the only player that is responsible for, or is, indeed has the impact on how well a society performs. It is just one, arguably quite significant contributor to that, but we need to be able to separate those two out.
Okay, thank you. Martin?
I'd like to just emphasise the point about presentation and communication. There's lots of technical points about the National Performance Framework, but I think it's underpresented and its communication isn't great. And that's improved recently, and Kay was making the same point, I think, because we've had more technical data coming out. In Virginia and in Canada, they've made a great effort to be much more open about and to try to communicate what is happening to the public. Now, most of us have got better things to do than read stats about what the government is doing or not doing. But there is a point at which you can move a rather dry subject like all this data into the public domain, because it's only when you have that process you get a real substantive discussion about what kind of society we'd like, where we're going to put our investment, and if we've got difficult choices, where we might make those choices. I think we've underinvested in this area of presentation, and I say we, I think the government has. I suspect in part that's because it's a lack of confidence that this has a great deal of support. I hope the support that is increasingly coming will give them more confidence to put more investment into presentation and communication.
Any of our remaining three witnesses wish to comment? Francis?
And 2 points. One is following up on what Kay was talking about following the money, and obviously this discussion's in the context of a draft budget. I think from our point of view, it's very difficult to follow, to make the link between a budget line and how that's going to impact on certain indicators. And I think we actually might need a better way of doing it is perhaps focused policy evaluations once the money's been spent. So to give an example around that, the enterprise body's budget line is increasing for the next 2 or 3 years. Oxfam we don't really know enough about whether that will whether that's good or bad, but it's about actually looking at, is that investment in the things that people value? Is it in employers that will ensure that people have secure, suitable, satisfying work, that pay a living wage, that don't utilise zero-hour contracts, that provide work in good locations? The other point is around areas that we don't particularly measure well, or that aren't well covered in the NPF. One of those areas is sort of social capital, if you like. We don't have particularly good indicators in the NPF looking at family relationships or relationships with friends, and that came quite high in terms of levels of importance in the Humankind Index. Also being part of a community, that isn't really reflected in the NPF, but again, that came quite high in the Humankind Index. The other area that we don't particularly measure well, that I think Stephen's touched on before, is around work quality. And from Oxfam's point of view, people said work's important, but not just any work. It's secure, suitable and satisfying work. So we really need to ensure that we try and get data around that.
UK?
I would just say that part of my job is to get our members involved in the policy process, and I think the technical issues around the visual use of the website itself would really help. And I think like data journalism's really moved on. We are trying in unison to get better at using better images to show the kind of complex information we want to show, and I think if the website can take a leap ahead on that, it will really help with the wider issues about just ordinary people rather than sad techie geeks like ourselves who do like to spend all evening with statistics.
Speak for yourself. Stephen, you began and we'll now end the session.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of points. First, as I'm conscious I never get back to Gavin's question about the number of indicators and the hierarchy of indicators. And I think the STUC is quite relaxed about the general design of the NPF as it currently stands. And I would hope that it would be allowed to evolve over time on the basis of the kind of consultation that the Chair was outlining earlier on. And I think it should also be evidence-driven. I'm certainly not attracted. Having agreed with my colleague from RBS, I will now disagree with him, and I'm certainly not attracted to the one-in, one-out approach, or the nightclub bouncer approach to policy development as it's been described. I don't think it works in any environment, and I think there always has to be good reasons why something should be dropped, good reasons why something should be included, and including a mechanistic element like that I think is profoundly unhelpful. I want to come back just to say a couple of things about data that's been discussed a few times. I mean, I think there are big issues around about access to data that Kay's described, but we also have to acknowledge that there's just issues of poor quality or non-existent data that is really affecting the effectiveness of the framework as it currently stands. Some issues we had a brief discussion earlier on about income and wealth inequality. I don't think we have the data in Scotland at this moment in time to have that discussion. Now, we have income data on a decile basis, and yes, we can compare the bottom and top deciles. We don't have it on a percentile basis, and we know that income inequality across the UK over the last 30 years has been a function of disproportionate amount accruing to the top 10%, but within that, a wildly disproportionate amount accruing to the top 1%. Now, we don't know what's happened in Scotland over that time or at this moment in time, so we need that data to be improved. The wealth statistics that are published on an annual basis by ONS, I have big issues about the credibility of them in an ONS national and regional basis, and I think we have to look into that. I don't think they're credible for Scotland. Some of the big issues we've discussed, we just don't have the data. I've seen a couple of your participants last week spoke about productivity should be have primacy within the framework. Well, we don't have information on, for instance, capital stock per worker in Scotland, and we know that is what drives productivity at a firm level. So, yes, it's good to have that discussion, and yes, we might know productivity statistics for the economy as a whole. Yes, we've got slightly less credible, but credible nonetheless, data for GDP per hour worked, but we really can't get below that to find out what's happening within the economy. Business investment, we really don't have credible business investment statistics for Scotland either. So, you know, if we're going to have that debate about productivity, we really have to have much better data. Finally, just to wind up in talking about or covering what Francis already covered in the nature of work, I think there's some stuff we can do very quickly in compiling a composite index for quality of work in Scotland. I think it would be insufficient, and there's another range of indicators we should be working on in the longer term. I think that will require investment, because as we're finding out at the moment, the surveys that tell us what's happening in the labour market are wholly insufficient to tell us about things like the use of zero-hour contracts, because the questions are not asked. So if we want to know the answers to those questions, if we want them to inform the NPF, and I hope we do, then we're going to have to invest in the quality of the survey that's currently undertaken.
Thank you very much, that's very helpful. I'd like to thank all of our witnesses today for their contributions, and also that from members of the committee. I'm going to suspend the committee now to allow members of a natural break and to allow a changeover of witnesses. Back at 10:55. Of the draft budget for 2014-15 with a roundtable discussion focused on preventative spending. I can therefore welcome to the meeting our second group of witnesses this morning: David Walker of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, Stephen Fitzpatrick from Glasgow City Council, Jan Baird from NHS Highland, Bill Alexander from Highland Council, and Chris Browning, NHS Fife, and Douglas Dunlop from Fife Council. Now, if you wish to speak on any issue, please, relating to National Performance Framework, please indicate to myself or the clerk. The session is intended to be a fluid discussion, so please feel free to contribute at any point. It's not a question of a Buggins' turn. Everyone will be able to come in as often as they so wish. And I'm going to be asking witnesses to comment on information provided by the Government on progress in delivering its preventative spend agenda. First of all, I'd like to go to David Walker, and I wonder if you can kick off with the view of NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde.
Thank you, Convener. In the Board's corporate plan, and certainly prevention and early intervention are one of the core themes that are put forward in the plan. But they're also put forward, I think, alongside a balance in terms of actually coping with the issues that actually face the Health Board and indeed the local authorities in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, which is actually trying to simultaneously care for people with very extensive health and social care difficulties. And I think it's that balancing act that I think is probably the biggest challenge that health boards and local authorities face in the west of Scotland, is about how to both at the same time invest in new programmes of prevention and early intervention, while at the same time managing their budgets in a way that can be effective in dealing with the problems that actually confront them right now. And I think it's fair to say that problem is intensifying as budgets grow ever tighter. However, that's not to say there isn't significant work being undertaken within Greater Glasgow and Clyde around prevention and early intervention. To quote some examples, within the field of children in terms of Triple P, the emphasis on working with to support parents in the care of their children, we expect will have benefits in terms of relieving some of the pressures that otherwise would come from statutory services. In terms of older people, we've sponsored work with the housing associations and community organisations around Greater Glasgow, around Silver Deal, which is aimed at trying to improve the health and fitness of older people to keep them fitter and healthier for longer, and therefore avoid the onset of crisis, or at least delay that for as long as possible. And also, Greater Glasgow and Clyde has been one of the strongest exponents, I think, of the Keep Well programme, which is targeted at middle-aged males who've tended to be the poorest recipients of health care, at least in a preventative and early intervention sense. And that's had quite a marked effect and has tested out the ways in which we make our services available, the way in which we follow up individual patients. We've also carried that spirit through to the way in which we're looking to redesign our services, major changes taking place in terms of health visiting, which is very much focused on trying to extend their early intervention and preventative reach. And we're also undertaking the same type of approach with district nursing, really looking to enhance their role in terms of anticipatory care, which you see as one of the major sort of contributors to the Reshaping Care for Older People agenda, that if we can have a more pronounced effect in anticipatory care, then we might be able to relieve problems further down the line. But I come back to this question about balance, because it's the balance, I think, the expectation that we will treat the population and their needs as they stand right now. Prevention and early intervention dividends will be felt much further down the track. And that may be 5 years away, it may be even 10 years away. And I think that's the reconciliation I think the health boards and local authorities are left to deal with, is that the coincidence of these, both the pressing need and the expected gains, actually don't coincide. And trying to run, I suppose, ride both horses at the same time can be quite problematic, which is why I think the change funds for early years and for older people have been helpful in terms of giving us some breathing space to actually provide some of that bridging finance that enables us to address both sets of issues simultaneously.
Okay, I mean, if folks around here want to come in on what David's said, please feel free to come in. Malcolm.
At the beginning, obviously, one of the issues that is often seen as a kind of indicator of progress, and in fact, I think it's one of the official Scotland Performs indicators, is the number of emergency admissions. And I see from the Glasgow paper, it says that both for over 65s and over 75s, they have continuously fallen throughout the first 4 months of 2012-13. So that's good news, since in many cases the indicator seems to be going the other way. So I wondered if you feel that that is it now a sustained trend, or was it a kind of blip? And also, I suppose it's too early to say to what extent the change fund has had an effect on that, but are you confident that the range of measures that you've outlined will have an effect on that?
I think you partly answered your own question. I think these are early trends. I think it should be borne in mind that the context is that Glasgow's level of emergency admissions is much higher than anywhere else in the country. I think what we've faced, certainly in relation to older people, has been a high level of volatility. This is a system which is under quite a bit of pressure. And we are recognising that we see that in terms of admissions, which can spike on any one of a few days, which results in problems being faced within the hospital in terms of A&E waits, which again is another critical national indicator. And I think we recognise that the measures I was referring to in relation to older people should have some effect, should start to play through the system. But there's a very complex agenda we're trying to deal with. There are many different factors which don't always pull in the same direction. And it's, I suppose, the building up that continuum, that enough critical mass, I think, to have a difference is probably the biggest concern. But in the meantime, I think we expect to continue to see, not that we're looking for, but we'd expect to continue to see some volatility in terms of those key performance measures.
I mean, Stephen, from Glasgow City Council's point of view, what kind of barriers are you having to overcome, other than obvious funding issues, in relation to delivering preventative spend?
Well, I mean, obviously the financial part of it is very significant at a time of increasing demand, which we were all very clear about. You know, I think just the complexity of what we're trying to do. We're facing at a time of decreasing resources, increasing demand, correlating that with a very significant change agenda around a number of things. In the submission that you've seen from Glasgow just sets out, even from a social work perspective, a whole range of initiatives that we're taking forward at this point in time, and we're no different to another partnership in that respect. And that demands a lot of energy, time, resource, and problem solving, etc. So the challenge around a change agenda across a system as complex and as wide-ranging as Glasgow, across acute primary health care and social care, and trying to cohere all of that is a significant challenge for us. We've got a number of, even if you look at a number of different receiving hospitals we have in Glasgow, right through to the kind of geographical spread of services, trying to affect change across all of that with all the different people who are located in different places in itself presents a challenge. I would also say that the cultural change that comes with this is also something that we are wrestling with. People who have worked in the system for a long time, some people will embrace change, others will be more ambivalent, and others will resist, and I think that's just something that we experience through this process, but we always expected that to be the case, but that again is a significant challenge for us.
John, to follow by Malcolm.
Yes. Complexity and so on, and just reading the Highland papers, so I'd be interested in their comments as well. You know, Highland, I get the impression there's lots of action, there's things actually happening. The Glasgow papers, I get the impression there's a lot of groups and discussions and forums and partnerships and networks and all these kind of things. I mean, is that just inevitable? Highland's smaller, more agile, Glasgow's just going to take longer to get things going, or am I misreading the papers?
I would hope that we're moving beyond just groups and people talking about things, and some of the information that's in there indicates some of the outcomes that have been delivered today. But yes, I mean, I think there is, and David would probably support this, it's taken longer to get things off the ground sometimes than we necessarily expected when we started with the Change Fund. And one of the challenges we have in a system as complex as Glasgow is once you reach agreement at the strategic level, how does that then filter through the whole system, and the amount of effort that's involved in that, and trying to reach right through the entirety of the system to get people to change in the way that the strategy outlines at the front line in terms of engagement with patients, with social care service users, etc. But I would hope that the paper doesn't misrepresent the position in Glasgow. Things are moving. There's many initiatives in place, reablement being one there, which is referenced, which has actually had a very significant impact in the city, which was one of the major priority areas for the Change Fund and for the Change Plan. So that's one example. And there's a number of others that are referenced in there from a social work point of view, but even from the NHS and from the independent sector and from GCVS, they could tell you about initiatives that they've undertaken within the city that are now being felt in local communities and making a difference to people's lives. So that's a very brief summation of what's happening in Glasgow, and I think you've got the JIT mid-year report, which goes into significantly more detail in relation to that, which would probably do more justice to what we're doing in the city.
Welcome.
I'm very conscious I'm sitting here between Glasgow Council on one hand and NHS Glasgow on the other. And I know lots of good things that are going on in Glasgow because we've just heard about them, apart from the fact that I knew anyway. But I was struck that we got a late submission from Glasgow City Council, and it's just given the history of some difficulties in partnership working in Glasgow, whether in fact we could have a reassurance that those difficulties are behind us, because it's obviously very important for this agenda, not least with the
committees. Gentlemen?
Oh, sorry, I was just, before David comes in, just to say we did get the train over together this morning, so if that's any evidence of joy work.
That's not too bad.
And we actually sat in adjacent seats, so with different carriages. Yeah, I'm aware of the reputation that goes before us. I think that isn't the past. I mean, there is a history there, which we are aware of, and there are reasons for it, which are important we learn from, because they will govern what we do in the future. But I think in terms both around children and older people, to quote these, and mental health and addictions, there are lots of good things happening in Glasgow which are based on lots of good joint work. And I think that has, in some cases, persisted through our difficulties, but has also, I think, arisen from them. And I think the working relationships we have, and John Mason was referring to lots of partnerships and groups and whatever, that's been part of the sort of renaissance in Glasgow, I think, of that relationship. But on the back of it, there have been a lot of actions right across the city, and I think the learning we're taking from that, both about how to do things differently as individual organisations, but also about how to plan and deliver better together, and the consequences of that, even pre-integration, I think is something we've made huge strides on. Still a long way to go, but I think actually we've got a degree of maturity in the relationship, and an appreciation, I think, about each other's roles, contributions, problems, which actually enhances the way we work together.
John Mason described the Highlands of Scotland in a way I've never heard them described before: small and nimble. Obviously, you've got a real geographic issues to contend with, stretching from Kintyre to Caithness. So I'm just wondering if you can talk to us a wee bit about the Highland experience, and of course, Mr. Alexander can follow on.
Yes, happy to, and I'm glad the submission gave a flavour of the work that's happening in Highland. For the purposes of that report, of course, that refers to the coterminous part of NHS Highland that we have with Highland Council, which is the integrated part. We also have, as you say, a partnership with Argyll and Bute Council. And of course, an area the size that we cover has its own issues in terms of remoteness and rurality, which I think are just as challenging and complicated at times. However, I'd have to say that there's no doubt, having entered into a partnership agreement in 2012 and taken forward integration with adult care now sitting firmly in the NHS, with responsibility for delivery then of primary, secondary, community care altogether, that we are beginning to see real advantages and changes in the way that we deliver services, and more importantly in the outcomes for adults. As you're probably aware, we entered into that partnership agreement on a 5-year basis with a 5-year plan. It was never expected to be a quick fix. I think my colleagues have expressed the challenges around not only the investment we have to make, but the disinvestment we have to make, and how we move towards a commissioning approach. We've been very focused as I say, on bringing together health and social care, but now the reality is, in terms of delivering for the people of Highland in the future, we need to extend that partnership quite considerably into the third and independent sectors if we're going to achieve the outcome. And in fact, from the preventative spend point of view, a lot of the work has to be with communities and how communities can engage with us and work with us to move this forward. The partnership agreement, of course, didn't change the outcome approach that we had already agreed, and the work that we started in the Change Fund and the additional capacity that's come by way of resource from the Council targeting preventative spend has enabled us really to build on a lot of the good work that we had started. Some of the work around falls, reablement, etc. But the important message I think we were trying to get across in terms of evidencing the improvements is not so much what we had to invest, what we were it's what we had not to invest in terms of secondary care. So you mentioned emergency admissions, and if you look at length of stay, emergency admissions and care in secondary care, we are convinced from trajectories that we've developed that if we hadn't made the change in community care, that our secondary care services would have fallen over. We would have had to invest considerably. And we are aware that as people age and require more interventions, modern interventions coming along in secondary care, there are pressures there, there are new drugs, etc. But we have managed to maintain the level of secondary care that we require for our population, despite a demographic that shows the population is ageing quite dramatically. So I think that in itself is evidence that we're getting it right in the community by shifting the balance and working on our preventative spend.
And how does your relationship differ between NHS Highland and each of the local authorities, you know, in terms of your relationship in the preventative spend agenda?
We've had very good partnership relationships, I would say, with both our local authorities, but there is no doubt that moving to an integrated model has made a completely different relationship. And the ability for the decision-making and the control over the development of services within one organisation, namely NHS Highland for adult care and Bill would talk for children's services, that by bringing staff together, the staff really feel empowered to be able to do things differently. Now, we're not in the same position with our colleagues in Argyll and Bute in that the services still sit separately, but we do have very good working relationships and partnership relationships with them that we hope to build on in terms of the legislation going forward.
Bill?
Well, obviously, from a council perspective, we'd endorse everything that Jan has just said with regard to adult care in NHS Highland. I think Mr Mason hit it on the nail early on when he talked about prevention being part of everything that is happening and it having to be about action. There is a lot of theory around with regard to prevention. There are a lot of fine words. The challenge, as colleagues from Glasgow have already said, is turning those fine words into action, and that has to mean total system change. And certainly our leaders sat down 3 or 4 years ago and they came to the view that to achieve optimum outcomes, we had to look at very radical measures, and they had to be bold in a way that people hadn't been bold before, and they had to show very bold leadership. I think along the way, they've been very struck by a number of things. They've been very influenced, I have to say, by the workings of this committee and your analysis of preventative spend and the evidence you've taken over the years. You can't fail but be impressed every time you go back to the Christie Commission report, which sets out that 40% of what we do in reactive mode, and if we had a preventative approach, we wouldn't require to provide many of those services. And in Highland Council, we've been very struck by the work of Harry Burns and others, and the fact that over the last 40 years, growth in inequalities has presented us with the most fundamental social and health challenges right across our population, and we have to turn that around. Now, we've endeavoured to turn it around through service change, we've endeavoured to turn it around through organisational change, but we're absolutely committed to prevention and early intervention. As part of that, the Council has committed an additional new £3 million this year for early years for older people and for deprivation, and there'll be a further £3 million next year. And just to pick up one of the points that Jan made in terms of the benefits of integration, the additional spend that the Council will be making on early years will largely be on health visiting services. They'll be spending on health provision. They'll be doing that because they think that will make the greatest difference by supporting all families and by supporting those families who have early indications of difficulty they'll actually make changes for the better right across the life course. And we wouldn't be doing that without the integration agenda.
Thank you, Malcolm, to be followed by Michael.
Several interesting points there, and in the Highland submission, I mean, firstly, your written evidence talks about sustained improvements in emergency admissions, so that's obviously very welcome. I was interested in what you said about health visiting. I'd be interested to know if that's, I mean, obviously there's been this debate in the Parliament about universal and targeted there, to what extent that's one or the other or somewhere in between. But finally, it was slightly puzzling, just some of your information about, you were saying the Joint Improvement Team had almost been critical of you for having a very low percentage of your change fund on preventative and anticipatory care. I mean, I think you gave an explanation of that, but it makes me wonder what you, if it is so low, what you are spending your change fund on. But I mean, I suppose the explanation you're giving is that you'd already been doing this and it was coming from other resources. But since we're focusing on the change fund, it would be interested to get some explanation of that.
I'll let Bill respond, but Jan also wants to come in on that.
If I can pick up the change fund and then come to universal and targeted. The change fund, both for early years and older people, is incredibly helpful to make some early impacts. But the change funds will not create a preventative approach on their own. It has to be about the totality. So it has to be about how that additional funding is used to create early change, but also to lever in, as a catalyst, system change. And therefore, you do have to look at the totality. If we just look at a spend plan around £3 million or much less in early years, and if we just look at projects, we're not actually going to deliver a preventative approach. So we have to look right across the totality. And I would suggest that any analysis that only looks at the change fund spend is actually not looking at prevention. Secondly, in terms of universal and targeted, again, I think you probably answered your own question, it has to be a combination of both. If you put optimum resources into the total population, then clearly you're spreading that resource very thin. But somehow you have to have a practice model that identifies both those groups that already have significant need, but critically, the early indications of groups of the population where significant investment will make a difference, both in terms of outcomes for them, but also preventing much more investment in future years. And it is about getting that balance. And I think if you look at parenting, for example, you can identify those parenting courses, those parenting supports that should be available for all families, and those particular supports that should go in either at critical times or for critical groups. And you have to do a combination of both.
In relation to the Joint Improvement Team and the Change Fund, I would echo exactly what Bill was saying about the whole fund that we're looking at, not just the change pot. But I think we caused some frustration because we took a considerable amount of time to start to spend the change plan and the change fund. And that was because we invested a lot of time in building our relationships with the third and independent sector. We now have an adult services commissioning group, which has third and independent sector and users and carers around the table, who have responsibility up to the board to look at how we commission services in the future. And that just doesn't happen overnight. There wasn't a situation of trust with the third and independent sector. We had purchaser-provider agreements in the past. This was about working more closely with them in planning how we do things in the future. So we really felt we needed to take that time to invest and build that trust, and we think that will pay off in the longer term as we move now from a change plan to a strategic commissioning plan.
Okay, Michael, to be followed by John.
Thank you. Just to make an observation, when Mr. Alexander was talking about the movement towards preventative spend, even when budgets aren't as restricted as they are at the present time, to move away from one set of services or a recognised service, normally in the acute sector, towards preventative spend, it means reducing the budgets in one area to guide the money towards the other. That means, again, changing from sort of high-profile, reactive, visible services to more longer-term and supportive services, which don't have the same profile. And that then becomes, requiring a culture change, not just in local communities, but amongst those who are standing on the outside watching these things happening, and I include politicians in that, because it's very easy for politicians to say, they support in principle what you're doing, but when it comes to closing that facility in my constituency, I'm going to oppose you. And we have to get beyond that sort of short-term thinking. And I'm just wondering if having encountered any of that or experienced any of that, how do you change the culture that allows that type of transformation to take place without the kickback from the loud voices and sharp elbows?
I have to say, I think that's spot on. That is the challenge. And that's, I suppose, why I talked about political boldness and leadership at the outset. When our council began to talk about preventative spend, every department of the council thought this was a great thing. And I have to say that the initial focus was around potholes. It would be great if we've got preventative spend. We can fill in all the cracks in the road. They won't then develop, and we won't have to spend a lot more on the roads. We spent time looking at this, and every department of the council is now absolutely committed to the fact that preventative spend is about inequality and health and social care outcomes. And that we are investing in preventative spend to make the lives of every single family, every single individual, and every single community better. And the preventative spend allocation that was created for early years and older people in deprivation, it didn't come from my budget. It came from right across the council. So every single service contributed to that pot. And we had a budget meeting of the senior management team last week, an all-day budget meeting, and the first session that the Director of Techs and the Director of Planning and Development and the Finance Director, and we're all involved in, was on preventative spend. And we looked at the work of Professor Phil Wilson, who's a GP, and we looked at the work of an economist who focused on the early years, and we looked at the work of Suzanne Zeedyk, who's a psychologist, and that was every single one of our directors focusing in on preventative spend, because they believe that only by reducing health inequalities and only by supporting children in the very earliest years and only by addressing the demographic time bomb that's coming around for older people, by shifting the balance of care, can we continue to provide services right across the council over the next 20 to 30 years. It's the only plan we've got. It's plan A, and there isn't a contingency. And we do believe that every single part of Scotland, just like this Finance Committee believes, has to be totally committed to that. It's built into our single outcome agreement. It's built into our council programme.
By Jan.
Thanks. Well, Jan Baird had mentioned the third and independent sector, and I saw in the paper it specifically said a key aspect of the change plan was the requirement for this to be produced and signed off in collaboration with the third and independent sectors, which came across to me as they are very much integrated, they're part of the system, it's all working together. Now, in Glasgow, on the other hand, it says a transformation fund has been established allowing the third sector to apply for and access change fund monies, which comes across to me as they are out there applying for money. They're not really part of the process. So I'd be interested in thoughts on that, and also actually from Fife, what your relationship with the third sector as well.
Okay, Jan, to be followed by David.
Just pick up on Councillor McMahon's point about culture to give an example of where we're seeing the change in culture. We have done some redesign work with a community hospital and a daycare centre, which are on opposite sides of the river. But prior to integration, had their own client group, their own patients, often who would go to different aspects of care, but the actual organisations never really communicated with each other. We looked at how, on a patient journey and a client journey, where daycare fits, where the day hospital sits, where inpatient sits, and how we could look at that differently, and started using our daycare centre, which is now part of NHS, in a very different way. And the significant difference is the staff who worked in the daycare centre were of the view that elderly people came in there for them to look after them, because they couldn't look after themselves. So when you come to daycare, we will look after you, we'll do everything for you, we'll meet all your needs, because that's our role. Now the staff are of the view, when people walk through the door, we've got an opportunity to enable those people to be independent again, to get them back to living in their own home, not dependent on the daycare centre, but living in their own home and being part of their community. And that took a huge shift in culture from the actual staff. And it's been so significant, and they now see themselves as having that brand new role, which has given them a real lease of life.
David, to be followed by Chris.
Thank you. If I just might pick up a couple of points that were made earlier before coming back to John Mason's point about the third sector. in Greater Glasgow and Clyde, we too have invested in health visiting services for prevention. So quite a significant commitment made by the board to invest in health visitors for exactly the reasons that Bill was saying. So that was maybe something I didn't mention earlier. But let me just pick up the point about how prevention and early intervention, the point that Michael McMahon made, is actually paid for. And I think it is one of the big challenges that lies ahead, because while organisations like health boards or local authorities can make some extra provision to support prevention and early intervention, I think what the Christie Commission was talking about is a much more radical change than that, which does imply disinvestment. And I think that's the really difficult issue to do. At any time, I think it's difficult, and I think Michael McMahon made that point about why it's difficult. But I think at this time it's particularly difficult because there are not only one call on the money. And if I can just say, it's happening at a time when budgets are going tighter and savings need to be found. But it's also happening at a time when other developments have already been, in Glasgow, for example, pledging in the pipeline. The Southern General Hospital is going up, and a lot of the changes that the board is engineering in its services and systems actually are going to pay for that new hospital. So it's an essential part of the health infrastructure within the city, but it does need to be paid for. And therefore, all I'm saying, I suppose, is that health and early intervention doesn't have an easy or a clear ride, if you like, towards the release of any new resources. That needs to be bidded and competed for. And I think in this present environment, there's no getting away from the fact it's a tough competition. On the point about the third sector in Glasgow have been partners right from the outset. They've been in with the bricks, as it were, and I think have been quite formative in terms of influencing how the partnership has actually taken shape. And one of the outcomes of that was the Transformation Fund, which is a fund of over £1 million, which the third sector has actually led in terms of the distribution of, which has gone to a wide range of community organisations across the city, and has really played a big part in terms of trying to boost the community infrastructure. And if we're talking about effective prevention and early intervention, it's not just, I think, on the measures that we as statutory organisations take, but it's about how we resource our communities to play a much fuller role in terms of supporting families and vulnerable individuals in their communities to be more resilient. And I think that's been a huge success, and the third sector, I think, has played a leading part in that in Glasgow.
It was just to reply to how the partnership works in NHS 5 and the local authority. We have the benefit of one local authority, one health board, so we don't have the same number of committees that we've got to try and get people to attend. So the partnership works far, far better because you have to have far fewer people involved. And we have what we call a partnership management group, which is fully representative of people from the local authority, the private sector, the voluntary sector, NHS 5. And it's through that group that we've had the full discussion and debate about the best use of the Change Fund. So the people have been at the table discussing what all the options were. So people from the voluntary and private sector had the equal opportunity to comment on some of the initiatives that social work wanted to do, that health wanted to do. So it was very much a partnership approach. So it wasn't just somebody else described, they were invited to bid. They were sitting at the table with a joint opinion view on how we should actually use the Change Fund to try and do the preventative change spend.
Douglas, to comment on that.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a couple of points, if I can, and I think specifically the kind of underpinning point that seems to be made by a number of speakers about how we create the maximum impact from the Change Fund to deliver a shift to preventative and early intervention. And I think particularly Bill's point is a good one, that this can't be seen as a distinct service, that the money provided by the Change Fund will do intervention and everybody else will carry on what they've been currently doing. The Change Fund has to be seen as a means by which we can reshape, reform and refocus both universal services and children's services and mainstream services in adult care, so that they are explicitly have at the heart of what they're doing a preventative and early intervention approach. And I just want to pick up perhaps two examples in Fife of where we're trying to do that and some of the challenges that we're facing in respect to that. The first bit is about reablement. We use some of the money from the Older People's Change Fund specifically to set up a reablement service for home care provision, and that was successful, and it provided a high quality service in order to maximise the independence of people who received it. But it was only 1/10 of the people who receive home care services. And so we made a decision to use the learning from that approach to reablement to spread that across all our mainstream home care provision. So all our home care services now have got an underpinning approach to reablement. And of course that seems right in principle, but of course the challenge in that is just how do you get such a big workforce delivering such a diverse service to have reablement as the heart of what they do, and that has to be through staff engagement, training, and I think people mentioned cultural shift as well. I think that's really important. Similarly for children's services, the council has a network of children's centres, family centre type provision, and we're using the Change Fund to do two things: to increase the capacity within these centres serving the whole of Fife, but also within that to use that increased capacity as a bit of a quid pro quo to say we're going to give you additional capacity, but it's on the basis that you reshape what you do, so it's explicitly about the whole family we're serving and for the whole of the time, so it's not just the period the child's at the centre, it's when they're home as well. So I think that the main drive for us in using the change funds is to roll the principle of use the funds to roll the principle of early intervention, preventative approaches to our mainstream provision, and that is primarily, I think, about staff engagement, and we have to invest a lot in that.
I mean, that's the point I was going to move on to, talk about staff engagement. I mean, how have the workforce responded in Fife?
I'm going to say more or less wholly positive, but there is a bit of a quid pro quo. What we're doing is we're giving additional resources to people to say, use this additional resources to maximise your approach to what the services you're delivering. So, of course, people welcome that, don't they? That's a good thing. I think the trick will be to carry that through when the change funds diminish or end, to carry that positivity through to actual change in practice beyond the terms of the change fund. So it's seen as being underpinning everything they're doing, and it's not just activity that's funded by the change fund that is preventative, it's actually everything people are doing.
You mentioned earlier on, Stephen, that there's some resistance in Glasgow, and if you can talk us through a wee bit about that and how you're working in partnership with the Health Board to address that.
Yeah, well, just to come in on the reablement point, I think in Glasgow, and it's not in the level of detail here, but we do have quite a weighty evaluation of the role of reablement in Glasgow, and part of that had looked at staff attitude, staff satisfaction, and actually in relation to reablement was very positive. Staff self-reported much higher levels of job satisfaction because of the nature of the service changing and much more person-centred, and feeling it was less task-focused and more focused on the individual and helping them to fulfil their potential. And also things like sickness absence reduced significantly as a consequence of that. So that gives you encouragement that if you can design the right model, then you can bring staff with you, and staff will see the benefits of that for themselves. I wouldn't want to characterise the staff reaction to our response to what we're doing as negative. I think it's just generally a challenge when people have worked in a certain way for possibly the best part of their career. Anytime they're asked to make a significant change. So one example we do have in here is what we have described as assessment at home, which we're now rebranding as step down assessment. And that's a process of change where we are looking to target very frail people who have gone through the hospital system, who have come through very often long periods in hospital, and we're trying to maximise the potential for those people to go home in the long term and not into care, because what we've found in Glasgow historically is that we have the highest levels of long-term care admission pro rata in the country, and it's one of the things that we absolutely want to try and shift around in line with the balance of care. And one example of what we're running into is concerns about risk to these people. They are generally close to the end of their lives, older people in their mid to late 80s and so on. But the policy, I think, is clear, that we try to maximise the opportunity for people, even when they've been in hospital, to go home. But what we're finding is that the tolerance for risk, if you like, from professionals in a hospital setting, an acute setting, and that includes social workers who are based, and also generally tends to be lower than for people who are managing the same level of risk in the community. And it's the setting that is a significant factor in relation to that. And what we're trying to do is to build confidence around different pathways for people to say, actually, with the right assessment, the right support, working together across the system. And this is an example of where acute care, primary care and social care all come together, and we've got professional leads in each of those areas working on that. We actually need to try to shift attitudes right across the system. So, for example, you know, it's not helpful if acute staff are saying to families, because families have great influence in these kind of situations, that your mother or father needs long-term care before the social care assessment ever has the opportunity to be undertaken. And this is the kind of thing that we're trying to shift. And it's not that people are mal-motivated in any way. It's really just about saying, actually, we need to be clear about the distinct roles of the professionals within the system. Once your health needs are addressed in hospital, then the social care tasks and the primary care tasks need to take over, and what we need to do in line with the policy is give people the chance to go home. So this is one example of an area where we're trying to bring people with us. And it's a new way of working, a new way of thinking, and it's not that people are negatively disposed towards it. I think we just need to work very hard to persuade them that actually we're not putting people at risk. We're doing what overwhelmingly most older people want to do, which is to go home for as long as they possibly can.
And you're doing it safely. Chris, to be followed by Bill.
I just wanted to comment on the staffing aspect in relation to we've established a hospital at home team within Fife, which is very much about replicating all the care and assistance you would get in a hospital setting, but in the patient's own home. And I think one of the major shifts we've seen is the engagement of consultants, geriatricians, to actually engage in a home model of care. Historically, consultants are very married to their hospital beds, but the support that we've had from consultants and from some general practitioners with a special interest in this model, we've really seen a huge level of engagement in delivering this alternative model. So I think it's a very positive story because we've got the consultants, the medical staff involved, we've got allied health professions, physios, OTs, nurses who we did have to give specific training because it was a very different way for the nurses to work where you were actually making the diagnosis and assessment within the person's home. So I think within Fife we've seen a huge level of engagement with that, and we've seen in total about 70 additional staff who've populated these teams and been trained in this new way of working.
Okay, before I go to Bill, John, what's the
well, just specifically on that point, I mean, taking a consultant round 20 homes must be a lot more expensive than having the 20 people in the beds?
It is an alternative model of care. We do have the consultant covers in each of our community health partnerships. We've got consultant-led care, but again, part of it is skilling up your nurses so that they can actually do an enhanced level of assessment, but they always have the backup that the consultant at the end of the day is still the consultant. But in terms of the appropriate models of care, we believe that it was more appropriate to try and retain the people in their own home or get them home quicker, so everybody did sign up to that model.
Bill?
I think you've seen in asking about staff engagement, you've triggered something pretty significant. Firstly, I would echo what Dougie said, which is our staff are up for prevention. They like doing it. It makes sense to them. We're talking about here in a finance committee because it makes financial sense. It makes professional sense as well. But while being up for it actually is difficult and it does introduce new challenges. I'll give you 3 examples. Firstly, Jan talked to you about change in daycare for older people. A daycare centre used to be quite a settled, safe, understandable, predictable environment where the staff cared for people. And they cared for people until they needed to move to another level of care. An establishment that now has to re-able people, support them to be independent, support them to do things instead of doing them for them, is a much more challenging environment. And to support staff to take that sort of risk, it's not just about risks in hospitals, it's risks in community-based settings as well, really does mean building ownership and involving and engaging them in a very significant way. A second example would be about the control that we all have in our silos around resources. Moving towards prevention means breaking down those silos, and it means giving up some of those controls. If a school needs some additional support to help a child stay in school, then social work has to be able to drop the gates, drop the defences, and get that support in quickly. That means a social work manager who's been used to a pretty defensible set of resources in the past, having to open that up, and that's quite uncomfortable. But thirdly, the whole area of community capacity building, and when you talk about prevention, you have to talk about community capacity building, means a new relationship between us as providers of services and planners of services and communities. It means moving away from the we know best attitude, you talked about that earlier, to actually communities can do this, and frankly they can often do it better, and why not just hand over some of the resource to them to let them get on with it. Now that's not the way we've done things in the past. And for us as leaders and managers, that's very difficult, and it's also very challenging for our staff, and we have to work to take them with us as part of that agenda.
Evan.
I hope that That's okay.
No,
yeah, sure. I mean, I'm just interested to hear the thoughts of witnesses on a question. How do they see the various change funds developing in the longer term? Is it something that you think we need to progressively increase in terms of the budget allocated to them? Or is it something longer term you progressively decrease as the preventative spend agenda becomes more embedded within the local authorities and health boards? And is it ultimately something where you know, a long way down the track, you say we don't actually need change funds anymore because they've achieved their objective and we now don't need them? I just wonder what witnesses' views are on that question.
Firstly, I think there's a clear tension in the fact that current change funds are short-term, in that we have to use them to achieve change. If there was any sense that those funds were going to become long and recurring, I would suggest that the tension and the pressure for change would reduce very significantly. Currently, we know that if this is to achieve both better outcomes for people, but also reduce costs, then it has to work over a set period of time, and we've actually got to start taking the costs out of the mainstream services. And just to move on to that, I think when we talk about prevention and when we talk about putting money in and creating new services and doing all these very exciting things, that's great. But we've also got to start to plan a bit further down the line, and we've got to start planning for taking the money back out. Because if I'm spending money on children in the early years now, then I've also got to accept that my spend on additional support for learning services, my spend on residential school placements, my spend on looked after children is going to reduce in the future, and we've got to have a budgetary model that actually sees those budgets coming down in the years to come. So while it's perhaps not something that's easy or nice to say, because it would be great to have that money forever, wouldn't it? The reality is if you said that that was long-term and recurring funding, then the pressure for change would reduce very quickly.
As a Director of Finance, you're not a surprise for me to say that I think we do need to ensure that we keep getting additional funding, but I think we've all been used in the past. We used to get bridging funding, which allowed us to move other long-stay patients into a community setting, and I've always envisaged that the change fund was just like old-fashioned bridging finance. And to my mind, it's not so much about using it for prevention as avoidance in the future of investing in the old models of care. That we know that we've got an ageing population, we know the complexity of their care is getting ever increasing, and we need to be able to make sure we plan looking forward. And the only way we can do that is to know that we have got some bridging finance to allow us to start putting the new models in place and stop investing in the old models. It's how long a time you allow people to actually manage to make the change over to the new ways of delivering. So I would always make a plea that we could continue to get some additional funding until we can actually make that change, because I think you can only do it once you've got a critical mass of investment in the new services and that they've had time to bed in, fully deliver. And it's not a short-term change. We do need time to make sure it delivers.
Okay, Jean, followed by Douglas.
Thank you. Just on a slightly different topic again, but just to ask about localism, really. The three areas that are represented here today are very different in every way, I guess. And how do trying to fit local priorities with national performance indicators, if you like, is that easy? Does it cause a tension in certain areas, or is there are you satisfied that the national programme fits easily with what would be local priorities? I know it's mentioned by a couple of people in their papers.
Okay, Douglas will be followed by Jan.
So yeah, I'll maybe touch on your comments. I was actually going to respond to Mr. Brown's comments earlier on, if I could. Yes. Okay, thank you.
Free for all.
Yeah. I think the question about how quickly can we tail off the change funds is a really, really interesting one. And actually, I think the answer is we don't know. Because what we're seeing is significant demographic changes, both for older people and for children. numbers of children in care are continuing to rise over the past 5 or 6 years, maybe levelling out a bit, but certainly significantly rise. The number of older people increasing. And what we don't know is the impact of these demographic changes on the demand for services. And I think it really has to be, my view would be, it has to be an iterative approach, that you can only really make judgments about the future continuation or focus of change funds when you've seen the success or the impact of the first phase. I think it's too ambitious to say we can stop the change funds because we'll have sorted it in 2 or 3 years' time or 18 months' time. I just don't think that will happen. I think what we have to do is to say, take stock of what is our demographic societal position in Scotland at that point, and how do we continue to retain the focus on prevention in the longer term. Just on the comment on localism, I think by and large we can translate the broad national outcomes into activity at a local level. I think part of our difficulty is identifying, from a children and families perspective, particularly in early years, identifying quantitative measures that we can accurately say that matches to the long-term qualitative outcomes that the government have rightly set, that we're all signed up to. And there's a variety of approaches to that, accumulation of individual data, as well as broad surveys, 27 to 30 months, surveys of children. But these are works in progress just now, and we haven't quite got there. That's my view about it yet.
Okay, Jan, to be followed by Malcolm.
Again, in response to Mr Brown's question about the Change Fund, I would agree exactly with what my colleagues have been saying. Just to add to what Dougie is saying, the demographics is not the only pressure that we have to face over the next 20 or 30 years, because we know the changes in interventions and technology are meaning that we are actually in secondary care, there's a lot of pressure on secondary care for our ageing population. The changes in anaesthetics mean that we do more interventions that perhaps we wouldn't have done with older people, because it's now safer to do so. We have interventions in the cardiology, for example, that are developing all the time, which again weren't something we might have considered with older people because of the risks. Those risks are being reduced, which means these interventions are now becoming an expectation. So there's a balance here around the non-steady state that we have. The demographics are impacting, but also the technology and the improvements in interventions are impacting, which was my point earlier on when I said it's about what we've not had to put into secondary care in terms of investment, which evidences the change.
Malcolm, to follow by David.
I was really interested in what Chris Bowring said, and to some extent backed up by the following two speakers, because it impacts, obviously we're doing a lot of, including this committee, on the joint working bill, because I suppose what Chris Bowring, you could draw the conclusion from that Chris Bowring might be very pessimistic about how the budgetary arrangements are going to work for the, whichever model of integration is adopted, because you seem to be saying that you need some central allocation of funding in order to make these shifts in the balance of care, whereas obviously the Scottish Government in general wouldn't support that as part of its joint working proposal. So because I think a lot of people are quite pessimistic in that sense about the funding, well, not the funding arrangements, but the funding scenarios for the joint working, because people, because of the demographics and so on, people feel, well, there's not really going to be much of a monetary shift of money from acute care into these. So to some extent, are you actually making a plea for the Scottish Government to make specific allocations for the joint working arrangements?
Do you want to answer that point, and then I'll let David in?
Not. I think the models that we've all been working with around the Change Fund are the correct way to go. I just think right at this moment, we're in year 3 or 4 of the Change Fund. I don't think at the end of year 4 we're going to be in a position where they've had a chance to fully deliver what we all envisage is the future model of delivery. And it is just to allow local authorities boards some certainty for another few years to allow these new models to really get embedded as the way forward. We don't want to, over winter, have to open up more and more hospital beds. We want these alternative in the community models to be there, to be the way we provide in the future. I just don't think we're quite at the timeline yet to allow us to stop investing in backup in hospitals because we haven't got all the community models fully working yet. So I'm not pessimistic, I'm just give us a bit more time.
Can I ask you what kind of timeline you envisage, given the comments that Bill made?
I would like to think another 2-3 years rather than just 1 year. 2015 at the moment is the end of the Change Fund, and I do think we need another couple of years beyond that. As I say, because I work with critical masses, you can only disinvest in one area once you've actually got enough change to allow you to make the move. Otherwise, you're working with two partial solutions.
I'm going to let Bill in, but David's been very patient, so I'll let him in first.
Yes, thank you. I would really want to come in and support the points that Chris was making. I think there's a question about evidence. I think the Change Fund was deliberately designed so that we could test new approaches. And I think largely that's what the Change Fund has been used for. Now, some of these will work and some of them won't. But actually gathering the evidence that they work is a job in itself, and some of Douglas's comments touch on that, about local information gathering to actually bear that out. But I think that's the confidence that's actually been sought locally, is that some of those interventions in Glasgow, we're able to pilot some of those in some parts of the city. So there's a whole question about rolling that over the whole city. But what we're, I think, being challenged on locally is the demonstration of the impact they have. And it goes back to the points that Malcolm was making earlier about the impact on our emergency admissions, the numbers of people actually being admitted into hospitals. Some of our interventions have to start biting on that. They have to start really showing that impact. And yet some of the cause and effect of that is quite difficult to plot, because there are there's a very, very complex jigsaw we're dealing with. There's lots of different variables in it. And it sometimes can be difficult to determine which particular ones have actually had the biggest effect. The other side, which the point Bill was making about the concurrent planning, that we have to plan simultaneously to take resources out. I know my colleagues in acute, are only going to do that if they get that sustained evidence of admissions really stepping down. And that's a task, actually. I think people have talked about culture change. I think people in acute are certainly feeling under a lot of pressure just now. There have been a lot of changes in acute services anyway, for other reasons, to try and make our acute system more efficient. New hospitals, as I was referring to in relation to Glasgow. So actually to try and, I think we're not yet as sophisticated as we'd like to be able to manage the resources across these interfaces. And I think, I concur with Chris, we need, I think, a bit more time to come to give us some of the reassurance that these interventions are actually working. Bill.
Yeah, I'd just like to make it clear that I concur with my colleagues about this. The first issue is that the change funds are being used as a lever for change. They're not about pouring new money into an old hole. They're about building a new landscape. Are we there yet? No, we're not there yet. How long will it take for us to get there? Well, I think Dougie made the point I would agree with. We don't quite know yet. But the bottom line is that prevention has to be about facing up to the fact that we will not have the budgets that we have had in the last 10 years over the next 10 or 20 years. That we do need to have a different model of providing services. And therefore, we have to use the funds in the short term, however long that might be, to get us to a more sustainable model of providing services in the longer term. So we have to accept that new money is coming in now so that there'll be less spend in the future. And at some point, we have to begin to plan on that basis.
Okay, I want to move on to another tack, actually, and I'll go back to yourself, Bill. The Joint Improvement Team has reported on progress in relation to the older People's Change Fund. I'm just wondering what evaluations have been in the early years Change Fund.
But in the early years?
Yes, what evaluation has been undertaken?
What evaluation?
Yes.
In Highland, we have a current evaluation of the delivery of children's services, but it's right across the whole model. It's very related to our practice model, which we've had since 2010, which the Scottish Government now has built into the Children and Young People's Bill. And it really doesn't separate what are the elements that have contributed to better outcomes. Are they about prevention? Are they about organisational change? Are they about the practice model? Because the three of them are also interrelated. I think that your question leads on to the often asked issue, which is how long is it before you get a return on this investment? And I would suggest that there are two answers to that, in that in many ways, the return is the long ball game. It's in the longer term. It is about better health outcomes through the life course. But I would also very strongly suggest that there's an immediate return as well. If we invest in supporting a family who's in crisis today, then that's likely to produce better outcomes for that family today. The family will be happier, the family will be more resilient, a child might not come into care. That will also be cheaper tomorrow. We'll get that return very quickly. It's the same with the example that Jan gave about using daycare and using community care instead of hospital provision. We actually get that return today. I do think we need to be better at measuring and monitoring, and I'm quite sure that directors of finance will be holding us to account for that very soon. And therefore, I would accept that we do need better evaluation. And I think Mrs. Urquhart's point is very good. We need an evaluation both on a national level, but we also do need evaluation on a very local level.
Okay, thank you. Now, we've talked about close working between local authorities and health boards. I'm just wondering, given that there's so much good work going on between, individual local authorities and individual health boards, whether work is being undertaken to share the best practice across health boards and across local authorities, rather than just within localities. I wonder if anyone wishes to comment on that. David.
I'll give it a go. I think yes. I think the Joint Improvement Team has actually played a valuable role in that, in actually providing some of the glue and the interconnection. But that is on top of, if you like, the professional networks like ADSW and the Institute of Health Service Management, Chief Executive, NHS Chief Executive. So there are, I think, a number of mediums through which that good practice can be exchanged. But the Joint Improvement Team, I think, has given a very pronounced focus around that. And recently, just at the end of last month, the start of the month, there was an event involving, to which all the partnerships were invited, held in the Beardmore in Glasgow. And it was showcasing, I think, a lot of ways in which the Change Fund had been used in exactly the way that speakers have been testifying to really test out new approaches and some of the evidence that they were able to present about the success of that. So I think that was quite a good way of actually showcasing that. And I think, in addition, the Joint Improvement Team have done a good job in terms of creating a sort of electronic network between partnerships as well, which does enable people to find out readily what's going on, who the lead people are, and to follow that up.
Yes, Stephen, followed by Douglas.
And I suppose we're not just relying on others. I mean, the JIT has been very helpful, as David described, in relation to this. But from a Glasgow point of view, we are always conscious of the risk that we become consumed in our own complex world, probably no different to anyone else. And David, myself and colleagues from across health and social care have made a point of trying to make connections with what other people are doing in other areas. So last year we spent some time up in Aberdeenshire, speaking to colleagues from across the system there, and Dundee City too, and they were very generous in their time hosting us for a day. We've also got plans to link in with Edinburgh to evaluate, and I suppose almost a peer review what we're doing across the two biggest cities in the country. And we've got some time in with Renfrewshire as well over the course of the next couple of months. So we are keen to make sure that we are picking up on good practice. I think what you will see probably in terms of the JIT's influence across some of the mid-year reports is there's a lot of convergence around some of the more proven changes and new service models and enablements been mentioned by a couple of people today, for example. So you are seeing some of that intelligence shared right across the system, I think, about what's working elsewhere.
Douglas, before by Jan.
I was just going to pick up the issue of good practice sharing from the children's perspective, and I think in that context we have to mention the Early Years Collaborative, which the government have set up the approach where they're bringing a wide range of practitioners together over a long-term change programme for I think it's at least a 2-year period, 2 days in Glasgow, where there's a real opportunity not only to discuss innovative approaches to change management in early years settings, but also to share what's working, what's not working. And I think these forums in particular are proving very fruitful. And sometimes, as you'll know, it's not the formal presentations that's the real benefit. It's the informal discussions that people have with each other, the connections that they make, and how they follow up. So from a children's perspective, I think there is now quite a strong framework there for sharing best practice in the absence of something like a JIT for children's services.
Okay. Jan?
I think traditionally we've been very bad at this, very bad, in health boards and in councils. And I think the pilot mentality that we used to have, where you piloted somewhere and then you tried to roll it out, and of course, well, that works in Highland, it won't work anywhere else, or it works in Glasgow and it won't work anywhere else, was the rhetoric that we heard all the time. I think we've moved on quite considerably, and I think part of that is the JIT, I think, have had a significant role, but I think part of it is also around an outcome focus. It's not about how many teams have you got, how many rapid response teams have you got, how many integrated teams have you got. It's how are you making a difference for the people of your community. And I think we as organisations can relate more to that, because we know that we might do it differently, we might tweak a model, but if the outcome's there, then there's no denying that's the way to do it. And for us, certainly in Highland, we strongly denied any rumours that we were having a pilot around integration. We took forward integration because it was right for the people of Highland, and we would stand by that. If other people feel that what we've done would help them, then that's great. But I think there is more of an understanding now in terms of the outcome focus that helps us all to share in a much more effective way.
Thanks for that. Now, we've got no one who's requested to speak, so what I'd like to do, given we've been talking for more than an hour in this discussion, is to try and wind things up. What I'd like to do is go around each of our guests and to see if there's any final points you want to make to the committee, which may be an issue that has come up in the last hour or so in our deliberations, or it may not. So who would like to go first? Bill.
Say anything very long or very extensive other than to say I think it's just fantastic that the Finance Committee is dealing with these agendas, has been leading the way, and that we've married what makes good professional sense with what makes good financial sense. I spend a lot of my time lobbying for more resources, and more resources are great, but actually my job is to use the resources I've got as effectively and efficiently as possible. And the prevention agenda allows us to focus on that, to provide better outcomes for people, but also do it as cost effectively as possible. And I think it's very helpful that you've created this focus around that agenda. And as people have said, we do need to continue to keep that focus. We do need to sustain that in the years to come to deal with the very significant challenges that we do have in front of us.
Thank you. I mean, the committee is determined to continue to keep a close eye on this, and it's very heartening to see that there's been significant progress since we last discussed this issue. Chris.
Again, I would just like to say, I think that we've really welcomed the opportunity to use the Change Fund and to have this discussion here today. But to emphasise that the Change Fund is only one of the tools in the toolbox that, we're looking at. People have commented about other pressures in the acute side. We've got a lot of different agendas we've got to try and address. And I think the Change Fund has actually been one of the more useful aspects of funding we've had, in that it's given us the opportunity to test things out, to try things out. And that's why I do feel that we do need a bit more time to use that Change Fund, along with all the other work we're doing around waiting times initiatives, our unscheduled care plans, our winter planning, just to give us a bit more time to just see how we can actually deliver on all of these good initiatives that we really do believe are the right models of care, because we're looking now at the outcomes we get, not just the outputs and the measures. We can count admissions, we can count discharges, but it is about the overall health well-being of the people who now can benefit from staying at home if we can keep funding these right models of care.
Stephen.
Just, I suppose, in brief, I think it's, again, I would welcome the continuing interest of the Finance Committee in this agenda. I think it's potentially, arguably, the greatest health and social policy challenge that we face going into the future. The scale of the challenge, the change agenda around us cannot be underestimated. It's very complex, it's very pressured, and we've talked about the timescale for the Change Fund, and I think we do need a bit more time, but at the same time I take Bill's point that it can't be never-ending. There needs to be some impetus around delivering on this, but certainly I think I can certainly reference my own experience is changing thinking right across the system. People are changing, and it's about allowing enough time for those changes to be delivered in the way that others have spoken about through the committee today.
Grateful for the opportunity to come along and to be part of the conversation and discussions today. I think it's really been very helpful, and hopefully for yourselves to hear what we've been doing. It is a big change agenda. We're in it for the long haul. It's not a quick fix. If we're going to make it sustainable, we do need to ensure that we continue to put the change in place to make sure that we achieve the outcomes we want. The change in demographic is a good news story. The fact that we're all living longer is a great news story. We all tend to think, oh, doom and gloom, and it's, you know, but actually in terms of, we've got great opportunities in terms of improving people's quality of life. And that's fantastic. I think the one thing that we haven't discussed today, which we do need to log, is the change in public expectation that needs to go along with this. We've talked about staff, we've talked about professionals, we've talked about how we all look at different models, but we also need to manage the public expectation and how they need to understand they need to work with us. If we're going to keep them healthy, particularly in living longer in a rural community, then the community needs to work with us and be part of that. And that's a message I think we all have responsibility for.
I mean, the committee actually did its own inquiry into demographic change in the ageing population, and it was heartening to find that people who live longest also live healthiest as well, so that's clearly a good thing. Douglas?
Yeah, I would just want to emphasise, from my perspective, I think that the success of prevention and early intervention is going to be around reshaping mainstream provision and universal services. It's not about a small targeted response to this. It is about reshaping the whole system approach to us. And the challenge for us all, I think, as officers to be supported by politicians is how do we create that change while we're continuing to meet increasing demand. And I think that's the real trick that we need to try and address in the coming years.
Thank you. And David, you began, so you can close the session.
Perfect symmetry. I too would thank you for the opportunity to come today. I've welcomed that and the discussion and indeed the Finance Committee's whole approach to this. I would make a couple of points. One is about, I suppose, courage and leadership, which was touched on earlier. And that's, I think, something we recognise within partnerships locally is vital, both amongst our staff, but also amongst our local communities and members of the public. But I think it's also important nationally, because if with this agenda is to go forward and the climate that's we're facing, there will have to be changes to things that we've become well used to and which become cherished to us. And I think Michael McMahon touched on it earlier, is the reaction to that isn't necessarily going to be favourable. I mean, while I think prevention, early intervention is often acknowledged as the right way to go, if it means changing something or taking something away, then perhaps the support isn't quite as rock solid. And certainly I think with our attempts to engineer change within Glasgow, we've encountered some of that. We touched again about staff earlier on, and Jan mentioned public expectations, and we've seen that as well. I mean, I think that there will come changes that need to be made. That may be hospitals that need to be closed. It may mean care home provision that declines. That's going to rebound locally. It will also rebound nationally. And I think that's going to be a test, I think, about our resolve about making this happen. Is that we do need to see the consequences of our actions and be prepared to back them.
Thank you very much for that. Lots of food for thought in this morning's discussion, which has been very helpful to the committee. I'd like to thank all the witnesses for their contributions and indeed also those contributions from committee members. The start of today's committee, we agreed to take the next two items in private. I therefore would like to close the public part of the meeting and allow a short recess so that the public and official report and witnesses can leave. Thank you.